Hey everyone, Screenplay Archaeology host KiramidHead here. Just wanted to get some plugs out of the way before the new episode starts. We have now come under the umbrella of Fandom Live Media, which is also the home of the Table Reads podcast, which is a fellow unproduced script podcast, where they read said scripts out in full over several episodes. So if you like this subject matter and you're curious about a different format for it, definitely check those guys out. Not the least reason which is because you'll be paying tribute to my new podcast overlords, and that can only have a benefit. Also, check out the Shelved Film podcast, which covers similar subject matters. They're not tied in with us, but I want you to go check them out. I want to make that recommendation because I'm just a nice guy like that. And as usual, be sure to check us out on social media on Facebook, Tumblr, and Twitter. We're on almost every means of listening to podcasts. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, a bunch of other places, especially now that I'm on a new platform which can distribute it to a whole ton of different places. So be sure to check out Spotify, Google Podcasts, stuff like that as well. And also a couple of things I want to throw in at the end. We do have a Patreon page. There's not much there. I can't really think of a rewards tier at the moment. And also, I have a Discord server that's been put together for a while, so if you want to show up and try that, as long as you're not an asshole, nothing will happen to you. You won't get kicked out. Just follow the rules. You'll be good. Check that link out down below. And with that, enjoy the episode. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Screenplay Archaeology podcast. I'm your host, KiramidHead, and today I am bringing you a new episode. This one is going to be based around a pair of adaptations of Stephen King's novel, The Stand, and they both more or less follow the same basic plot setup for the book, so I'll just give you your synopsis here. It's a post-apocalyptic story about a super flu that was made in a lab and then gets released on accident. It wipes out 99% of the world's population, and it stars this sort of eclectic cast of survivors who all sort of come together and they divide into these two groups. It becomes a big battle between good and evil, essentially. So yeah, that's more or less a set for the plot. Now, it's a book which I've read mainly the uncut and whatever he wants to call it, the uncut and revised version or whatever it's called. And that's the one that Stephen King put out in 1990, where he put back in all the stuff he had to cut out in 78. And, well, he didn't put everything back in, from what I understand. There was some stuff he left out because he said it was rightly left on the cutting room floor, and then he added some new bits. And he also tried to update it for the 90s, and it wasn't entirely successful because there's a few glitches in there from what I remember. I went on eBay and I got a paperback copy of the original edition just to get it, and I still haven't read it. But it is a book that I do really, really like. It is one of those big, grand King epics where you're either in for it or you're not. You're either into what he's doing or you're not with it. And it is a big, long, thick brick of a book. And I do have like different experiences reading it every time. Sometimes I'm really into it and it flies right by, and sometimes I'm just like not feeling it and it kind of drags. There's like a couple of chapters in particular that are super, super long that drag. But overall, I will say it is a great book, and I even like the ending that people seem to not like. And I'll get into that when I talk about the scripts and how they handle that. And I have seen the 1994 miniseries that was eventually adapted. It was okay. It had its problems. Like, I feel like about 80-90% of the casting is really, really good. Then you have Jamie Sheridan as Randall Flagg, who's kind of Cora Nemec as Harold, and then you have Molly Ringwald as Franny Goldsmith, who is just like, in some scenes she's good, and in other scenes, like there's a scene where they're listening to the radio and she's going like, wow, this super flu thing sounds really bad. And I'm like, was that the best take you got? But overall, I'd say for the time they made it, being, 1990s network TV, they adapted that story almost as well as they could have. They still fucked up a little bit here and there, but I feel like of the Stephen King miniseries that was a thing in the 90s and the early 2000s, that was one of the better ones. And they're doing a new miniseries now, which is coming out next month in December. It'll probably be December before this goes up, but it's next month when I'm recording. that's coming out, and I have some concerns about it. Not necessarily the casting, even though I'm looking at Whoopi Goldberg and some of those images and going, is that the hairstyle you're going with, really? Less the casting and more just some of the comments the showrunners have made where they're talking about how, like, they're deciding to, like, kind of skip over the superfluous stuff and do it in flashback. And I'm like, I mean, that's the part of the book everybody seems to agree on is really good. So it's like, why would you want to do that? And they're talking about, like, we like Contagion too much. We don't want to be like Contagion. And in the back of my head, I'm just kind of like, fuck Contagion. There could be more than one thing about a fucking viral outbreak, especially considering the world we're living in right now. And yes, I am fully aware of how weird it is doing an episode like this in the middle of a pandemic. But, you know, it is what it is. But I am curious about that to see how it comes around, how it turns out. I mean, I don't have CBS All Access, you know, like a lot of people, but, you know, I am curious to see how that eventually turns out. Now, to go into the backstory of these scripts, more or less, it started, the idea of making the Stand movie started around 1980, because, you know, King was, you know, getting popular, and he had met George Romero around that time. He had met him in around 78. And they got together and they decided that they wanted to do The Stand. But before they did that, they wanted to do Creepshow, a smaller movie, so they could do that, make a profit. And they knew because King's name was pretty big, they knew they could get the money from a studio, but they wanted to, you know, do well with a smaller film so that they could, you know, fight for more creative control of the Stand movie, from what I've read. And Stephen King has this really interesting quote, which I thought was pretty funny, where he says, you know, he wanted to be the one to write the script because he said, you know, if anyone's going to bitch it up, I want to be the one doing the bitching up, which I thought that was really funny. And more or less what happened there is that they kept working on it, and King did his first draft, which supposedly got pretty much everything from the book in there. And bear in mind, this is going off of the 78 version, which had less stuff in it. And it came out to around 400 pages, which would have been about 6 or so hours worth of film. And they said, well, that's not doable. So he tried to condense it as much as he could, got it down to about 300 pages. And then that was still too long for a movie. So he figured, so he said either we could split it into two, but the decision was made to just make one movie. And I've got to see if I can find the quote, because this quote is so funny, where he's talking to Romero. Yeah, this is funny. He's like, because he says, you know, it would have been 40 minutes longer than Godfather 3, even at that length. He says, okay, we're at this point where we got to lighten this boat, George. We got to throw some people overboard. Who's expendable? And he says, well, let me think about it. So he thought about it, and I thought about it, and I came back to him. And there's this little kid in the book who pals around with one of the characters. I said, well, Joe can go. And George kind of says, well, I like him. We tried to get rid of a couple of people and didn't want to stay down. And so they basically got stuck with that. They couldn't quite figure out how to condense the story down into a single movie. And things went on. And eventually it dragged on so long that Romero ended up leaving his company, Laurel Entertainment, that he was running with Richard Rubinstein, and he left. So it made his involvement in the project kind of tenuous. And it didn't help that during this time, you know, getting the money was a bit more difficult because Firestarter, Cat's Eye, Silver Bullet, Maximum Overdrive, Running Man, like all these Stephen King adaptations were not doing as well as they could have been. And the only like runaway success was Stand By Me. So like it was kind of difficult to get the funds together to do this movie at this point. So eventually what happened is that King decided to step back. And Warner Brothers, who they had their deal with, and Richard Rubinstein, they eventually ended up hiring Roscoe Pallenberg, who was a fan of the book. And he said about it that it was one of those things that he thought was really good. And he says he thought he had film potential. And so he finally got the job to adapt it, you know, going through Warner Brothers. And now let's look at his filmography. Now, I did cover a Roscoe Pallenberg draft on this show before he did his thing, because he's done a lot of collaborations with John Boorman, basically. And one of those things he did was the unproduced Lord of the Rings that we did, which was not a great adaptation necessarily, but was a fascinating read. Like, it was bizarre. But yeah, his writing credits. Okay, so I was wrong. He did not write Zardoz. I thought he did. But he did work on Exorcist II, The Heretic, Excalibur, The Emerald Forest, which is a Boorman movie, which I didn't see, and his relationship with Boorman ended on that one because of they conflicted over the casting or something I've read, and also Druids, the Christopher Lambert movie, which I have seen. I barely remember it. I think it has like a 0 on Rotten Tomatoes or something ridiculous like that. Or is that the same Druid? Okay, it is the same druids. It's the one that's also called Vercingetorix, and the movie really has nothing to do with druids. At least not from what I remember. But yeah, so we've got a guy who helped write Exorcist 2 and Excalibur. That's like two polar opposite ends of movies. You have Exorcist 2, which is just a bad movie, but it's a fascinatingly bad movie because it's just what the fuck. And then you have Excalibur, which is actually really good. So he got the job and he wrote a handful of drafts, and I'm going to focus on his first draft, which is from October of 1989. And he went on to write at least two more. I'll briefly mention that as we go along. And so what he does here is that this draft is about 149 pages long. So he condensed all this down into about 2.5 hours, a little over 2.5 hours. Or a little under. I can't count right now for some reason. Yeah, it would be a little bit under 2.5 hours. But it tells basically the story of the book as I summarized at the beginning. And so it opens with Stu Redman, who, main character at the stand, one of the main characters, and his friends. They're sitting outside Hep's gas station in Arnett, Texas, when a car comes swerving down the highway and crashes into the pumps. And this is a little bit more of an action-y moment here in the movie that is in the book, at least from what I remember, because Stu has to run out and turn off the pumps at the concrete island, whereas he does it inside in the book from what I remember, and that's where he does it in the miniseries. And so he has to run out there and get to it in time so there is no big fire. So that's a nice little moment. And the man driving, he doesn't get a name in this. They never refer to him as Campion, which was his name in the book. And I don't remember if that was something that was added for the expanded version. Because I know the expanded version adds the prologue where he leaves with his family from the military base and spreads the virus. And I know the original version opens with the gas station scene, so that's what this version is doing. But, he's drying, and his wife and child are dead, and they've got grotesque swollen necks and mucus dripping from their mouths. So you've got the corpse imagery that you see in, like, the comic book and the Bernie Wrightson illustrations in the extended version. And the cops and emergency workers take them away, and later on, the military arrives in Arnett, rounding up the townsfolk. And the people who were at the gas station are questioned by a civilian named Len Creighton, who's behind this plastic sealed barrier inside like an airtight room. So kind of like what's in that Alien 3 script I covered a while back, where they kept going in and out of the plastic room. And so he's questioning them, and it becomes clear that not everyone who stopped at the gas station was rounded up. And Norm, one of the guys who was there at the crash, starts coughing. And then all the townsfolk, they get flown away on helicopters. So this is moving really, really quickly. This is like a little less than 10 pages. This took a couple days in the book, and you get like an entire chapter from Norm's perspective where he's feeling bad and he doesn't want to eat any of the food in the fridge because the sickness is making it look bad to him. So this is all very much condensed, but it's not bad. It's sticking with Stu Redman and his perspective. So this is a good way to condense some of the stuff. And so we then go to a beach house in Malibu where newly minted hit singer Larry Underwood is kicking out his girlfriend before returning inside, where the place has been trashed by a party the night before. And he's confronted by a drug dealer named Yuri, who he owes money to, and escapes in his rented car with a mysterious young woman in tow. She goes over how his hit single won't bring in enough money to fix all his problems and tells him to go home to sort things out. And he actually pulls over to the side of the road, and she gets out of the car without him seeing it and is standing on the side of the road before he drives away. And that's a very strange scene, and this is an original to the script. There's something Roscoe Pallenberg talks about, especially like he talks about whenever he mentions Lord of the Rings script, and he talks about it a little bit when talking about The Stand, is how when you adapt something, especially something this big, you have to take it apart and put it back together, and sometimes you have to invent new stuff. This is something he invented, and it's a strange choice because in the book, Larry is met by his friend who was like one of his backup players that he hasn't seen in a while because he kind of left him behind. And he says like, I ran into the drug dealer. I got him to go away for a little while. You got to get out of town so you can get your shit together. And then Larry gets out of town, just kind of wakes him up. And so they kind of combined a few scenes here, like him throwing the girlfriend out is a version of a scene that happens later on in New York in the book where he has like a one night stand with this woman who gets pissed off at him because he's kind of an asshole. So it's kind of, folding those together. And putting that here is actually not a bad way to condense that. But the weird, like possibly supernatural woman who shows up and like and pushes Larry in the direction that he needs to go. And I understand the big theme of this story is the hand of God working amongst ordinary people. Like that's a thing that comes up in the book literally at the end. But it's just a little weird that a mysterious woman who I guess is an angel shows up and like pushes him where he needs to be, or maybe she's an agent of evil considering, how interested the forces of evil are in him in this script, because they are particularly interested in him here in a way they aren't quite in the book compared to anyone else. And the people of Arnett, they arrive at a high-tech lab in an undisclosed location, and they were flown for hours in the plane with blacked-out windows, so they have no way of knowing where they actually are. And the symptoms have gotten worse. And then Stu and 2 others are separated from the main group, and they are examined by men in steel suits. Like, they're doing all these invasive procedures, like shoving in the rectal thermometer and just being, like, really harsh and, like, impersonal. Like, it's definitely a military operation. This isn't, like, going to, like, your regular doctor. And Stu is sealed inside a hospital observation room, but only after unsuccessfully trying to fight off his escort. And they're panicking because they're going like, he might break the seal. And we then go back to Larry, who is driven as far as Oklahoma, where he stops in a diner. People around him are beginning to cough, and there's like a guy who mentions that he got out of Arnett just in time because they see a news report on the TV about how Arnett has been quarantined due to a leak from a power plant, a radiation leak. And this is, the cover-up that they've put in place. So this guy's like, oh, I got out of there just in time. So it's like, okay, this is one of the vectors for the spread of the virus. And then there's another news report about a tri-state massacre, which they've actually changed here to make sense that the local news in Oklahoma is reporting on this. They made it like it's Oklahoma, Nevada. It's Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona instead of Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico like it was in the book. So they changed that a little bit. And thinking of the map of the United States in my head, so I guess they went from Oklahoma, or either that they went in the other direction. I'm guessing they went from Oklahoma, did some massacring there, skipped over the big top part of Texas, didn't do shit there, fucked around in New Mexico, and then in Arizona. Very strange. So we then go to a convenience store where the perpetrators of the massacre, Lloyd Henry and the guy whose only name is Poke, are holed up and surrounded by cops. Poke coughs and gets taken out by a police sniper, and Lloyd gives himself up. So yeah, this is a very condensed version of that scene. I actually really like that idea that he has the virus and that kind of pushes him out just far enough that the sniper gets him. That's actually a pretty cool little moment. And we then go to Stu, who is dreaming about the car outside the gas station. He gets shoved in by the dying driver and has to climb over the dead family to get out, finding himself in a cornfield where a feline eye watches from the shadows. That is very Sauron from Lord of the Rings, and Lord of the Rings was a huge influence on The Stand. Like King said, his point of writing it was to write a distinctly American Lord of the Rings, and that's basically what he did. And he kind of ended up doing that again with The Dark Tower, but that's a different story. And he's pursued by something only seen as a cat's paw, which changes to a bird's claw and then to a cowboy boot with a silver filigreed tip that resembles a claw before waking up in this hospital room. And that's one thing I will say in favor of this script. The way the dream sequences are described are really creepy, and if directed correctly, would be pretty scary. They're written really well and very surreal. And so he's met by Creighton, who, he's not wearing the suit, and he promises to answer questions in exchange for cooperation with the medical procedures, but doesn't say much as the information is classified. You get the moment where Stu pretends to cough just to freak him out. He goes, well, I know how serious this is. And we then go back to Larry, where he is sleeping in his car outside his mother's brownstone apartment building on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So he drove across country pretty quickly. She wakes him up, and they go inside together, and over breakfast, they discuss his music career, and they leave out the best line from that scene, because she says, you sound like a colored person, and they leave out the line where he says, that fine brown sound, she sure do get round, which they can't do in the miniseries, because I have no problem at all with the actor who's playing Larry Underwood in the new miniseries, because he's actually not a bad pick. He wouldn't be the first person I would have thought of, but I think he can do it. It's kind of funny that line is in the book and then they cast a black guy. I just find that kind of funny. So that line's obviously not going to be in the movie unless they do a joke about how he sings like a white guy, which could be hilarious. And they bring up, and their strange relationship comes to light because they bring up the subject of Larry's dead father, who had a lot of debts, and the stress of the deaths eventually killed him. And Larry doesn't think much of his father. He thinks he's a loser, and he kind of storms out. And from there, we go to a mental hospital in Indiana where a firebug called Trash is being wheeled into the electroshock therapy room. And one of the orderlies is sick and starts coughing badly, and everyone freaks out and leaves, leaving him alone with Trash, and the machine is still on, electrocuting him. Now, that's a really cool introduction to Trash, or the Trash Can Man, as he's called in the book, because it's mentioned in the book, because the way Stephen King writes, he gives everybody an inner voice, goes over their entire backstory through their thoughts. It's especially true in The Stand. You get introduced to a new character, you get their entire stream of consciousness immediately. And in the book, you not only do you get his whole life story, but you do get the idea he has spent some time in a mental hospital. I don't think in the book like he escaped from the mental hospital because of the flu, because of Captain Tripp's the super flu. But I don't think that's what happened. And if that's the case, that's actually a really cool, added scene to the book. Either way, you don't see it in the book, so it's still an added scene. And it's a really cool idea. And there's another quick scene with Larry and his mother where we learn that she's gotten sick. And we then go to a prison in Phoenix, Arizona, where Lloyd is being taken to his cell. One of the two guards escorting him gets sick, and they leave Lloyd in one of the holding cells still shackled. And that's a new addition. Not a bad one, actually. And we then catch up with Stu, who is still locked in the observation room as chaos breaks out in the building. And he sees like the men in like the spacesuits, as they're called, they're like running past his room in the hallway, shooting at each other. So things are getting pretty bad. And here's an added moment, which I think is really, really cool, because he watches an emergency report on TV where Tom Brokaw, he reads off a cover story issued by the White House saying, oh, this isn't anything serious between his coughs, and before losing it, and then he shows off his swollen neck and then madly babbles about the end times, and then he reads off a passage from Yeats's The Second Coming, and he gets led off by men in gas masks, and the report is cut off. Like, it's a really incredible scene the way it's written. It's a cool way to work in that reference to the Yeats poem, because that's in the book, and it comes in through the two military guys that are talking. In fact, I think in the book, Creighton is one of those two guys. You have Starkey, the general, and like his underling is Creighton, and Creighton's kind of been combined with another character called Denninger for the purposes of this script. The character of Starkey talks about how his daughter gave him this book of poetry by Yeats, and that he's not really like a literature guy, but he really identified with that particular poem. And that's a cool moment. It's the way they work it in here is different, but it's still really cool. And so back in New York, Larry comes home to find his mother gone and learns from a nearby store owner that she went to the hospital. Now in the book, he comes home and she's collapsed on the floor, and you find out later they dragged her to the hospital while things were going to hell. But I actually like this. This is a cool little cinematic moment, too. Larry heads over there, finds her in the ward stuffed full of sick people. He tries to get some help for her, but she dies right there, and he breaks down in tears. He finally, tells her that he loves her, but it's too late. Nice moment. And he then wanders into Central Park in a daze, running into Rita Blakemore, an older, wealthier woman, she's about 50, who is armed with a gun and still healthy. And he agrees to walk her home, and they get pursued right to her apartment door by some looters. Nice little tense chase sequence that I think has been added in here. And turned on by the adrenaline, they fall into each other's arms and they make love. So yeah, she's a character that got snipped for the miniseries, but is going to be in the new miniseries. So that's going to be pretty interesting to see. And Heather Graham is a pretty interesting casting choice. And we then go back to Lloyd in his cell, where he has painfully freed himself from his shackles. Basically, he basically just yanked it until he cut himself enough to lubricate his hands. That's almost in some Gerald's Game territory, and that book hadn't even been written yet. And he reaches for the dead body in the next cell and considers eating part of it, specifically its butt, which I thought was kind of funny, before trapping and eating a rat instead. And you don't see him eat the rat in the book, and you don't see it in the original miniseries, but here he just grabs the rat, bites into it. It's Jesus. Now, the way he hurts himself and his hands are bleeding in the book is that he does it unscrewing the bolts from the leg of his bed in the cell to reach through and pull the body closer to him. I do like the shackle idea, though. That's a neat little idea for a scene. And then we go back to the observation room where Stu is approached by Creighton, who tries to shoot him, and Stu gets the gun away from him and makes a deal, information exchange for putting the infected man out of his misery. And Creighton explains that the virus was created in a government lab and got out on accident, and that the guy who fled and spread the virus, they tried to get him by napalming his car, but they hit the wrong one. So, government intelligence there for you. He also explains that Stu is 100% immune, but they don't know why, and even mentioned that they actually directly injected him with the super flu, and he didn't show any symptoms, which is really fucked up when you think about it. And I think that is in the book at one point. They're going over it's going to one of the behind the scenes guys, and he's reading his reports, and it mentions that they did actually do that. And he mentions that he came in there to kill him because they didn't want if there were any survivors, they didn't want anybody to know that the government was responsible. And he wouldn't have known that even if you didn't go in there to kill him and screwed up guy, but okay. And what's interesting is they actually leave out this thing that was in the book, and maybe this was only in the expanded version where it's mentioned that they deliberately spread the virus after a certain point to make sure that the entire world got it. Where I was I read that and I was holy shit, because they deliberately spread it to both Russia and China just as a fuck you. Which that would have been an interesting thing to see. I wonder if they're going to do that in the new miniseries. I keep saying the miniseries, and I'm kind of nebulously referring to both because rather annoyingly, there's now 2 miniseries. Yeah. And Stu just leaves him there, and there's this really creepy scene because he decides, fuck you, I'm not gonna uphold the deal. He leaves him there, walks past observation rooms and through corridors full of dead people, and the observation rooms are specifically filled with people that he personally knows, before exiting the building, which turns out to be a VA hospital in Vermont. That's akin to a scene in the book. It's not exactly the same, but it is similar enough, and if directed well, it would have been equally as creepy. And we go back to New York, where Rita is popping pills while she and Larry discuss getting out of the city away from the pervasive stench of all the dead people. And they're interrupted by an infected person from several floors up jumping to their death, smacking into Rita's balcony on the way down, which is a nice, gross little detail. And she runs to the bathroom and starts vomiting, and the scene cuts off because there's a missing page. Now, the first draft, the hard copy that has been scanned and been around for a while, was actually missing like 4 or 5 pages. Now, I went to the second draft and found the relevant bits and copied them over and added them into the first draft. Except for this page, I couldn't find this version. So I think this was a scene that got completely condensed out for that draft, which is a little bit shorter. The missing page follows, and where the next page picks up, it's Lloyd in his cell, madly seeing Camptown ladies. So I'm guessing that's the scene where he eats the dead body. That's what's actually missing from the draft. And it goes back to Larry and Rita. They walk through the city, and Rita's feet are bleeding from the open-toed shoes she's wearing. And Larry doesn't notice until after an infected man chases them down with a gun to the Lincoln Tunnels entrance. He gets angry, yells at her, and leaves her there because Larry, as has been established, is not necessarily the nicest guy. He's got he's not necessarily a bad person, but he has this mean streak that really, fucks with him. He's got a nasty streak, which is a thing that comes up in the book. A selfish streak, I think they call it. And Larry walks through the tunnel, running into dead bodies, including one in a car that seems to talk and then lunge at him. And this is really creepy the way it's written. And hearing a noise, fires off his gun, but it's just Rita following him, and they emerge together on the other side in New Jersey. And once again, Larry crossing through the Lincoln Tunnel is more like the iconic scenes from the book. In fact, when they went to make the 90s miniseries, there was a poll that was held on a fan site where they said, they asked, what scene specifically do we absolutely have to keep? And they said the Lincoln Tunnel scene. So they they put that in the miniseries. I remember it actually being pretty decent in the miniseries for a mid-90s network TV miniseries, having to deal with standards and practices. It was a nice little moment, although it was a little overlit maybe. And then goes back to Lloyd in his cell, where he's approached by the walking dude who wears the same boots that were in Stu's dream, and he has a Stetson that hides his face from the audience. Now, what's interesting is this is a character more commonly known as Randall Flagg, but he's never actually called that in this script. He's just called the walking dude. And there's in the second draft, there's one bit where he refers to himself as Randall Flagg, and then that's it. So I'm just going to call him the walking dude for the sake of the episode. And Lloyd promises to do anything the dude wants as long as he gets him out of there. And the walking dude pulls out Gideon's Bible, which he holds in front of his face so you can only see his eyes. And he flips the pages, and there's a key, a flip book appearing to Lloyd along the spine of the book. And it makes a key appear to Lloyd, who then as soon as he's I don't think you believe me enough, Lloyd. And then it comes and the key becomes real, and he's able to get out of the cell. That's a really interesting thing that they do because they keep his face hidden, which is a thing the book does until very, very late in the book. And then the miniseries just said, fuck it, we're not even bothering. The original miniseries, I don't think the new one is either. That's one thing I'm not really sure about the miniseries is I think Alexander Skarsgård is actually not a bad pick for that character. I'm just not sure about the hipster haircut and the hipster beard. I'm looking at it and I'm just he doesn't look very scary. But no, then it's in this scene, it starts this whole thing in this script with the walking dude who's almost like an inverted Christ figure because he's always reading out Bible quotes to back himself up. And he always has this air of a religious figure around him, which is really cool. And it's a replacement for where he holds out the stone with the red eye in it, that the eye sometimes looks like a key, it sometimes doesn't, which he gives to Lloyd and lets him out of the cell. And so they do this here, and it's almost an even more interesting and kind of cool scene this way. And we then go back to Stu's dream, where he's being pursued by the walking dude who turns into a man-sized wolf that we only get glimpses of, and it's pursuing him. Stu runs for a shack where he sees an old black woman playing a banjo through the window. As he reaches for the door, a huge snout moves towards his ear and its tongue shoots out. Oh, that's so creepy. Only for Stu to awake by the road in New England, a dog licking his face. And the dog's collar reveals that it's named Kojak, and Stu takes him in. And that's leading me into someone who got the cut in this draft, and that's the character of Glenn Bateman, the sociologist. He gets cut from this, and I feel like he's not too missed because a lot of the ideas that he talks about are here. And the whole anti-technology screed he goes off on late in the book, that's gone completely, so thank Christ. But, I mean, it's kind of sad that he's missing, but they get the point, some of his points across pretty well without actually having him there. And this does affect something way later on, which we'll talk about when we get there. And elsewhere, also in New England, Rita and Larry, they take a spill on the motorcycle, and Rita clearly hurts her hip pretty badly, but she doesn't say anything because she doesn't want to, unleash the beast in Larry again. She doesn't want to get him pissed off at her. And we go to the road in Arizona. Lloyd talks to the walking dude who tells him about his past marching in movements in the 60s. And he mentions how every time he got close to the microphone, it'd make distorted feedback and it would make sounds in the language that nobody understood. And he knew Manson, even mentions fighting for the South, and he levitates right before Lloyd's eyes. And the way this is written is really cool because once again, it brings that whole Christ figure thing back into it because the way the dialogue is written and the way they're sitting around the fire, because he says Master, tell me something, tell me about yourself, tell me who you are. It reads like a biblical passage, which I thought was a really neat concept. And we then go back to the dream of running towards the shack, only this time it's Larry instead of Stu, so they're sharing the same dream. And the walking dude asks him if he wants to be a rock star, but Larry awakens in his and Rita's tent before his answer of yes can be completed. And he looks over to Rita and finds that she has overdosed on painkillers and died during the night, and he takes it really hard, blaming himself for not noticing that she was in pain, and not even noticing that she was dying next to him. And he gets out of the tent. They're on on a town green in a New England town. He just looks up at the sky and goes, "I am an asshole," which is a little on the nose. And that line just reminds me of the wedding singer. She made me a present. I am an asshole. It's I keep expecting a kid to walk up to him and go, "You're going to the mental institution." If you've not seen that movie, that's going to make no sense to you. And so Stu, he's crossing a New England suburb, and Kojak runs off, and he goes looking for him, and Kojak disappears until way later in this thing. And he runs into a large Bigfoot monster truck riding over the abandoned cars in the road. And this is something Pallenberg adds to the script. I don't think that was in any version of the book, but it's a neat little idea to get by the roadblocks. And it's being driven by 17-year-old Harold Lauder and his older companion, Franny Goldsmith. And this is a version of Harold Lauder that actually remembers he's supposed to be a fat guy because he's not in the original miniseries and it doesn't look like he's going to be in the new one either. And so after some debate with Harold, we learn that he's into Franny and wants her for himself, but she's not really into him. And it also transpires that they're having the same dreams as Stu, and they take Veronal to get rid of them. And Franny secretly palms her pills and gets rid of the pills. And they're heading for Nebraska, thinking they can find the shack and the old woman. And after some convincing, Harold allows Stu to come along, and Stu has to promise, I'm not after your woman, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to cut in, which is a line directly from the book. And there's also a little speech he has where he says 3 people and we're already arguing, 4 people and we're already voting, and which is a Glenn Bateman speech from the book. It was kind of cool to see that in here. And I mean, it is kind of weird that the East Texas redneck is giving the sociological speech, but it shows that he is actually a pretty smart guy. So I guess that kind of works. And we go back to Indiana where Trash blows up a petroleum refinery, getting badly burned in the process. And he passes out and dreams of the walking dude who transforms. He's a wolf who puts a Stetson on his head and then stands up and becomes a man. Trash hears the old woman singing and almost heads for her, but the walking dude talks him into joining him with promises of fire and destruction. I like this moment because he can see the shack way off in the distance. He can see the light and he can hear the woman talking. It shows that the trash can man is not entirely irredeemable. There is something good inside him. It's just buried really deeply. I think that's an interesting point that it makes. And he awakes, he's rubbing Vaseline on his burns and sets off. We then go to Larry's dream where he's surrounded by the girlfriend, the weird mysterious woman, his mother, and Rita, who literally rip his limbs off. And they're moving in to reattach automatically. And then the walking dude steps on one of his legs and says, "I'm the only one who can put you back together. I can make you a rock star." And he says, "The rock star is, they all call me Natas." And Larry refuses the offer and wakes up, finding himself being watched over by Nadine Cross, an attractive but somewhat kind of crazed woman with white streaks in her black hair. And she has also had these dreams and wants to meet the old woman because she thinks that old woman can look into her heart and tell her what's there. So we get a little bit of the complexity of Nadine here. Larry then meets Joey, a crazed boy who goes after him with a knife until Nadine calms him. And that whole relationship between her and the kid, that's something that was not in the original miniseries, but they've kept it, but it's kept in this script. And I like that because that's a very interesting relationship. And she then tells Larry about how she was playing with a Ouija board and it told her to save herself for the man of her dreams, which we kind of figure is the walking dude. And she thought they might be Larry, but she doesn't think so now. And they decide to travel together because she says Joey, he needs a father as well as a mother. So we got this weird family dynamic that's hinted at here. And then he says, have you heard the name Natas? And then she writes it on a piece of paper, holds it in front of a mirror, and it's Satan backwards, even though later on we find out that the walking dude isn't actually Satan. But, that's a cool little moment. Very Kubrick Shining with the whole red rum thing. And it then moves to a Kansas town where we meet deaf-mute Nick Andros and the mentally challenged Tom Cullen, who was just straight up called an idiot in the script, which I thought was kind of unfortunate, but also kind of funny. And, he has like a stomach ache, and so they go to a pharmacy or a department store to get Tom some Pepto-Bismol to ease his stomach. And they run to the young Julie Lawry, who drags Nick away for some sex. And there's a bit where Nick is like waking up afterwards, and then like immediately turns out it's in a dream because the walking dude emerges from her hair. And Nick can hear and he can speak, which is surprising him. And as he's running through the cornfield, he's chased through the cornfield, the walking dude is standing behind Julie with his hands on her shoulders. And he's being offered his voice and his hearing back if he brings the dude some kind of tokens. But he awakes, and Julie tries to kill both him and Tom as her tokens to bring to the walking dude, but they manage to get away on their bikes. So this is our introduction to Nick Andros and Tom Cullen in this script. The whole token idea is an interesting way to take Julie Lawry because she's just kind of a crazy bitch in the script who just kind of shoots at them because Nick turns her down because she wants to leave Tom Cullen behind and Nick doesn't want to do that. I do feel like, you gotta get this script to be shorter. But I do feel like you could have kept the introduction. You could have kept where Nick meets Tom. That you at least kept that scene for the introduction. That would have been better because it would have established their friendship a little bit more. I understand why they cut out all the earlier stuff of Nick Andros getting beaten up and, living, basically becoming a deputy. That's stuff that you kind of have to leave out if you're condensing it like this. But it would have been nice to see those two meet in the script as opposed to that. And conversely, I'm much more okay with the way Harold and Franny are introduced because that relationship, we get what we need to know about that dynamic from them. And it cuts out some of the earlier stuff with Franny Goldsmith because she is far from a fan favorite character from what I understand. And her introductory scene, she is so bitchy in the book. It's like, do I really want to follow this character? And she is a reasonably well-written character and she is pretty good. It's just she's not one of King's best. Like she does kind of have her annoying moments where it's like, King, you could have dialed that back a little bit. And so go back with Larry, Nadine, and Joey. Nadine wants to grab a pair of motorcycles for easier traveling, to which Larry is understandably uneasy because of what happened with Rita. And while Nadine teaches herself how to ride, Larry grabs a guitar from a music store and he and Joey bond over music. And it's really, really good the way this is written because he's playing and Joey is like calming down and getting interested. And he hands it to Joey to play and Joey turns out to be really, really good. And later that night, they play together for Nadine because he gets another guitar for him. And then Joey speaks his first words since either of them has known him. Welcome. So the way that like music is like the big communicator between these two characters, that it's Larry's passion and it's that same passion that brings Joey a little bit out of his shell, really would have been a cool little moment just from a audio visual perspective. And we then go back to Franny, who has her own cornfield dream with the walking dude chasing her down with a wire coat hanger, which he shoves between her legs. Was holy crap, that went further than I thought it would. And that's a recurring thing of her dreams where Flag, the walking dude in the book, is chasing her with the wire hanger because she's pregnant and she's afraid of losing the baby. And she awakes in the back of the Bigfoot in Ohio, and Harold suggests she takes 2 pills now, and Harold uses a special contraption to help gas up the vehicle, and he gets complimented for it, and then heads to a nearby store. Stu tells Franny that he's figured out that she's pregnant and throwing away the pills, and she says, the baby isn't Harold's, it was my boyfriend's, I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but then she thought she was going to get rid of it, but then everybody started dying, so she figures, having one more person in the world would be a good thing, and I like how that's explained. Then it cuts out the whole scene with the boyfriend in the book, which is not great. And then and they agree to keep it a secret. Harold returns with an awkward gift of heart-shaped chocolate box, a stuffed bear, and a negligee. And she goes like, oh, I love it, Harold, because she hugs the stuffed bear, and Harold goes, I love you. And it's like, ooh, awkward. And they run into a group of women led by Dana Jurgens and Susan Stern, who they're a couple. Like, it's kind of, it's brought up a couple times, but it's not super important. And they hold Stu and Harold at gunpoint until they mention the old woman from their dreams. And then the two groups agree to travel together and they set out. That's different. It's interesting that they put this meeting in here because in the original version of the book, they apparently just show up in the Boulder Free Zone later on, whereas you get the introduction with the whole, women being held hostage thing in the extended version, which he added back in later. So it's interesting that Pallenberg invented his own meeting scene for these characters, because Dana Jurgens does become a bit more important here than she was in the book. She's still important in the book, but in a different way. We then go back to Larry and Nadine, who they've apparently made it all the way to Ohio by this point as well. And they're dealing with their mutual attraction, which isn't really going anywhere because Nadine is saving herself for the walking dude while she's waiting, to find out what Mother Abigail has to say before she fully makes that decision. And so they run into Lucy Swan, another survivor who gets even more words out of Joey. And Nadine essentially gives up Larry to Lucy, holding on to her faith that, the walking dude is the one. And from there we go to the shack in Nebraska and we meet Mother Abigail, who's the black woman from the dreams, and she's in a dream of her own, where the walking dude attacks her home along with an army of weasels under his controls, and she awakes and she starts playing her banjo and singing, and I shit you not, she sings Stand By Me, which that is an incredibly meta reference. She sings Stand By Me along with the banjo. It would have been really cool to hear, and then she sees, these trucks of survivors, like these cars upon cars of survivors showing up at her house, and in the back of the first truck is Nick and Tom. And more arrive, and a feast is held, and because more and more people keep arriving, and she needs the door to get held open, so she takes her big-ass Bible and uses it as a doorstop, which, once again, is an interesting contrast, because you have Randall Flagg, who's very reverent about the Bible and reading off the passages and interpreting them, and, there's a scene where he's where they're in his territory, and his voice, the walking dude, he's reading Bible verses off over the radio like he's some kind of preacher. Then you have Mother Abigail, who's the force of good, and she understands that, the physical Bible is just a book, and she uses it like that. She's a very earthy kind of practical person. I think, the contrast between the two is really interesting, because the one who's more explicitly Christ-like is the bad guy, and the one who's just kind of a normal person, just a little bit more, is the good guy. I find that to be a very interesting contrast, the way that's written here. And their feast is held, and she talks about how she was born with the gift of the shiny lamp, and this other person goes, "You mean The Shining?" And in my best groundskeeper Willie voice, "Shh, boy, you want to get sued?" So yeah, that was an interesting little connection to make. I don't recall if that was in the book that she referred to it that way, but it makes sense, and she says she gets visions from God, and she said the survivors will split between her and the walking dude, and that a conflict is coming, separated only by the Rocky Mountains. And she also explains that the walking dude, he isn't actually Satan, but an old acquaintance is his. He's gone under many names, but he wouldn't mind being thought of as Satan. See, an interesting distinction to make there. And we go back to Trashum. This is where we hear, the Bible verses being read off by the walking dude over the radio. And my dog is freaking out. His car breaks down in the Nevada desert, crawls his way to Las Vegas, where the walking dude has set up shop. Followers of Mother Abigail are crucified in the streets, and he's met outside the MGM Grand by Lloyd, who has him sent up to a suite to rest, and Julie arrives shortly afterward with 3 prisoners in tow for the crosses. And she also more or less throws herself up at Lloyd, who takes her up on the sex offer. And meanwhile, Stu's group reaches Mother Abigail's shack, but they've already departed. Harold gets a message over the Bigfoot CB saying that they'll all be gathering in Boulder, Colorado. And the group travels on, and while they've stopped inside of the Rockies, Stu and Franny, they talk alone and admit their feelings for one another and make love. Harold sees this, jerks off to it, which is just, ugh. I mean, it's not yet, you don't actually see it. It's said that it's implied because he reaches below frame, so it's less Antichrist and more the Psycho remake, but yeah, and him being Harold jerk off louder was a thing in the book, which you don't need. But then he has a dream of the walking dude because it goes, I love how it just jumps into the dream almost like it's a Nightmare on Elm Street scene, because he's standing there in the woods and then the walking dude is standing right behind him, and then he offers him a chance of revenge. He basically plants that idea in his head, and he seems to slip into a state of madness. Like, we go to Larry's group as they approach Boulder, and it's made clear that Larry and Lucy, they're now an item. Boulder, everyone else has arrived, and Mother Abigail's preparing to meet the new arrivals in a university auditorium. And we learned that Stu has been elected sheriff, so they just skipped over a ton of shit in terms of the condensing here. That's one moment where like condensing the plot really shows through. And so Larry and his party arrive with Mother Abigail. She heals Joey, who comes out of his mad state, and he now remembers his real name, which is Leo. And Mother Abigail, like, she goes to look at Nadine, and she, like, the words catch in her throat, and she says, "You confuse me, child," which disheartens Nadine. And this is one of those moments where you get this in the book and you get in the original miniseries where you almost kind of get the idea that if Mother Abigail had spoken up and said something different, that maybe things would have gone differently. That Nadine herself was not totally irredeemable, but that, mistake, Mother Abigail makes this mistake, and maybe if she didn't, things would have happened a different way. But, it's a fascinating little idea of, the morality of the characters and whatnot, that even Mother Abigail makes her mistakes. And later on, Mother Abigail disappears, and Harold, speculating that she's gone to the wilderness to pray, suggests setting up a search party. And he plans to use this opportunity to kill Stu, but he backs off at the last minute because Stu actually is complimenting him, being really nice to him, because Stu's just an all-around good guy. Like Gary Sinise in the miniseries, basically perfect in that role. And I think James Marsden is actually a pretty good pick, too, for the new one. But, and I do like that scene. I like the fact that, he's almost blind to, what's happening with Harold to the point that he just believes in people to the point where he just doesn't see it. And also, Mother Abigail disappearing at this point, they have way condensed the Boulder stuff, because the Boulder Free Zone stuff in the book goes on quite a long time. Dear God, it goes on for a while, and it doesn't bother me that it does, but I do know that's a part of the book where people tend to get lost and lose track of it or put the book down. But they've really condensed that stuff down here. And there's a quick cutaway to the Walking Dude's followers uncovering a fighter plane, and then it goes back to Boulder where Nadine propositions Larry, who turns her down. And she then goes back to her room on campus where Leo freaks out and wants to leave. And she says, no, you go back to bed. You stay here. So those two relationships falling apart, it's like Mother Abigail doesn't know what to do with her and disheartens her. And she screwed up any potential relationship with Larry to the point where that's she can't do that anymore. And even her motherly relationship with Joey gets screwed up because of her association with the Walking Dude freaks him out. And then that upsets her. She really is a tragic character in a lot of ways, and I do kind of wish she was introduced, because her introduction to this, she just kind of vomits out her backstory, which is an unfortunate side effect of having to condense it like this. But, there is a little bit of the complexity with her here. And so she heads to an amphitheater in the hills, where she brings out her Ouija board, communicating with the Walking Dude, who's watching via Raven. And the way he's doing it is really cool, because he's in his penthouse in the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, and he's doing this naked levitating thing that he does and looking out the picture window, and he has his hands in front of his face in the shape of a bird, and he's flapping them and making a bird shadow on the wall, and that's making the bird appear in Boulder. That is so cool. I love how powerful he comes across in this. And the board starts to spell something out, and so she goes to Harold's house. Now everybody else is living in in the dorm rooms on the college campus. He decided to live in a house away from that. And I can't remember if that was a specific thing from the book. I don't think it was, but it's an interesting idea that he kind of strikes off on his own. And it's almost like that's the influence of the Walking Dude giving him a place to do what he has to do. And she seduces him into joining the Walking Dude's plan. Basically, we can do anything together except the pussy. Everything else is good. I'm not going to go into any of the details because the book goes into way too many details about that. Dear God, the peanut butter bit. Jesus Christ. But that's basically the idea. And then back in Vegas, the jet flies over the city, and the Walking Dude notes that it's only one plane with no bombs attached, but Lloyd says that Trash is taking care of that. And back in Boulder, Lucy and Franny take Leo to see Nadine, but she turns them away. And the image of her sitting inside the house and looking through the open door at them is an interesting sort of way to frame it. And Leo seems to sense that something is going on inside Harold's house, but he can't articulate what. So he's a bit psychic, which I think is in the book, but it's one of those real kind of throwaway moments that they don't really do anything with. And we then see Harold and Nadine working on old dynamite, constructing a bomb. And this scene, oh God, this scene is just really cringe with the sex stuff, because he's trying to carefully, because it's old dynamite that's sweating nitroglycerin. He's carefully trying to wipe it off, and she's jerking him off while he's doing it. And it's implied that he finishes, and then he whips a drop of the nitroglycerin and it makes a poop explosion. I'm like, okay, you're not Hitchcock. You can't get away with the train going through the tunnel thing. And so Franny, she wants Stu to investigate the house, but he says that, a vague feeling of something being wrong isn't enough. So she and Lucy break in while Harold and Nadine are out. And they don't find anything before they get back, and almost get caught by Harold before he is distracted by the sound of alarm gongs. This scene, it's pretty tense. It goes on for a little while, but it reminds me of that scene in Burn After Reading where Brad Pitt breaks into the house because George Clooney and Tilda Swinton leave, and then George Clooney comes back almost immediately. Only here they run into the basement to escape. He even goes in through the basement in that movie, but like a dumbass, he runs upstairs when he sees George Clooney coming back. So he doesn't get out through the basement. But it reminded me of that scene. And the alarm sounded because Mother Abigail has returned, weak but alive, and led by Kojak, who, holy crap, I had forgotten he was actually in this when he showed back up. As everyone gathers to hear her speak, Harold and Nadine, they plant the bomb in the auditorium and head out of town on their motorcycles. And as Mother Abigail speaks, talking about her pride and how the people don't know what to do without her, Harold pushes the button, and Nick's, which basically sets off like a timer. And Nick senses the incoming explosion and psychically speaks through Leo and Tom, getting people to start evacuating. And he throws himself over the bomb and takes the brunt of the explosion, but people are still injured. And so, yeah, he basically does the Captain America throw yourself on the grenade thing, and he dies. So he gets his heroic sacrifice, kind of like he does in the book. It's a little bit different here. Mother Abigail is now dying, and the explosion hastened. I don't think she comes back until after the bomb in the book, if I'm remembering right. But so that's another condensing. The way they condense it and like mash scenes together in this script, Pallenberg did a really good job with a lot of this. She's now dying and gives her last words, saying that Stu, Larry, Tom, and Dana need to head to Vegas to make their stand against the Walking Dude. And she says, you have to go as you are. And Franny objects, talking about how the baby has stopped moving, and if she loses that, she wants Stu with her alive. And then Mother Abigail, who is dying, I should say, punches her in the stomach, which miraculously makes the baby start moving again. And then she dies. Like, I mean, Franny is still kind of upset at her, saying, don't bribe me with a miracle, blah, blah, blah. And then Mother Abigail dies. Like, that was kind of a cool moment, because that doesn't happen in the book, I don't think. I don't think she, like, punches Franny in the stomach. I kind of want to see that in the movie now. I hope Whoopi Goldberg does that in the new miniseries, because that would actually be kind of funny. And so they're on a mountain road leaving and heading towards Vegas. Harold mentions to Nadine he doesn't want to give her up anymore. And so she surreptitiously steers him towards the edge of the mountain road, and he shoots off the road while she continues on. So he kind of dies here. He's not dead yet. We'll see that in a minute. So, okay, that moment in the book, I'm pretty sure Flag did that to him in the book. Whereas Nadine pretty much sets him up to die here herself. That's kind of fucked up. Interesting change. So she continues on, and Nadine meets the Walking Dude in the desert, and his face is shown for the first time. And the way it's described is really interesting, because it says he's both young and old, masculine and feminine, attractive and horrible at the same time. I don't know how you cast that. Now, interestingly, the actor who was attached to this version was Robert Duvall, which that would be fascinating to see him play that. But unfortunately, that wasn't meant to be. And Microsoft Word does not recognize surreptitiously as a word. Interesting. But she sees his face for the first time, and then he actually says, she says, what's your name? And he says, in this draft, he says, call me Richard. So, and in the other draft, he says, Randall Flagg. He doesn't give a last name here, and I think Richard was one of the names, because he always, every time he comes back, it's always under an RF name. And I think Richard Faraday was one of them, because in his introductory chapter, he's walking down the road thinking about like the long life he's had, all this different shit he's done throughout history. And he mentions some of the names. I think Richard Faraday was one of them. But no, he's not even called Randall Flagg in this. He's just called the Walking Dude and Richard. And he unzips his pants, and she looks down, and what she sees scares her, saying, you're going to rip me in half. And then he just grabs her, takes her there and then, essentially raping her in this version. And in the book, what happens is that they lay down, and it's described through what she's feeling, that she's just feeling cold. So you get the idea he has like a freezing icicle dick. And this kind of gets the implication that he's not normal without, because I mean, how do you visualize, freezing cold icicle dick? How do you do that without literally having an icicle pop out of his pants, which you'd never be able to do anyways? So the implication of what's going on is there. And it's a pretty scary scene, if I'm being honest. And it cuts to him. He's naked. I think he's wearing only the Stetson, and he's running through the desert with her in his arms. Her legs are streaked with blood. So whatever his dick is actually like, it was pretty traumatic. And he says that Boulder will be destroyed on the day of their child's birth. And he runs to the mountain road where Harold has crawled back to the edge and leans toward him with his teeth bared. So he's still alive. So you get the idea he basically eats him. And okay, so we go to the 4. Now, this is a change to the material, because Glenn Bateman and Ralph Brentner, who is not a terribly important character in the book, he's just sort of there. They've been replaced by Dana Jurgens and Tom Cullen for this whole part of the script, to be the 4 who go and make the stand. And it doesn't fully work in this version, because Dana and Tom in the book were part of this thing where they were sent to Las Vegas to be spies. And that's a whole subplot And so moving them here isn't necessarily a bad idea, but it still has the spy stuff folded in. And I don't think these two things particularly go together. I think that's kind of a problem. But so they're walking while Dana and Tom ride bikes. Stu and Larry walk while Dana and Tom ride bikes, and Larry thinks the others didn't follow her instructions correctly because she told them to go as they were but not take anything. Whereas those two have taken bikes, and Dana has this special cylinder she has wrapped up, and she doesn't want to say what it is. And Stu changed his clothes and brought a gun with him. And Tom, for some reason, is wearing a beanie, and I'm like, were you trying to get Flounder from Animal House to play this part, which would actually be kind of interesting? And that's one thing I will say. That is a character who in live action, like, because King writes his characters with very specific verbal quirks, and it's something that could very easily get screwed up in live action, and Bill Fagerbakke is absolutely perfect as Tom Collard. Like, that was a character who could have been part of the Robert Downey Jr. speech in Tropic Thunder, and they got him perfect in that miniseries. I'm curious to see how it goes in the new one. But yeah, he's a difficult character to get right, and interestingly enough, in this script, he never does the MOON thing, which is like his catchphrase. That never comes up in this, but he still feels like the character, though. And they're walking, and the fighter jet swoops down, and Dana brings out the cylinder, which turns out to be a Stinger missile that she found somewhere, because apparently this is now Metal Gear Solid, and she shoots down the jet, so we had to have an action scene, I guess. And they're like, well, we've been spotted, let's split up. And then the walking dude, Lloyd, and some of their men, they find the pilot who ejected, and the walking dude turns into a bird and kills him. And then the men start to doubt him now, going like, hey, our only plane just got destroyed and he just killed our only pilot. What's going on with this guy? He doesn't seem to be quite as together as we thought he was. And Lloyd is like, hey, dude's got a plan. He knows the big picture because Lloyd is the blind believer. Understandably so, of course. He's actually one of my favorite characters in the book because even though he joins the bad side and sticks with it, you totally understand why he did, because it was either join him or starve to death. So it's kind of like, so you understand his loyalty. And you get that a little bit here. And then the walking dude, he tries to spy on Larry and Stu in the bird form, but Kojak drives him off. So Kojak came with them. And on their return to Vegas, they run into Tom on his bicycle, and the walking dude says he keeps Lloyd from killing him, saying that, hey, and this is a line from the script. It's coming from a bad guy, so it's okay. He says, retards make for good workers. He then returns to his penthouse and Nadine, and the child inside her has already started to move, much to her horror. And then Tom goes to work at the military base under Trash, where they're stacking bombs in a pile. And Lloyd is like, hey, isn't that kind of dangerous? Because like, I like it like that. Because Lloyd can't actually tell Trash what to do. Trash is kind of like head of his own thing, according to what the walking dude wants. And then Julie works there as well, and she recognizes Tom, points him out to Lloyd, who tries to take over the operation. Trash reacts badly, crashing his little vehicle into a pile of bombs, which this was fucking hilarious. I don't know if this is good or bad, but the bombs fall over, they crush Julie, and then explode. That's so funny. She got like the Rasputinian death. She gets crushed and blown up. And Lloyd manages to drive away. Tom gets away on his bike, and Trash, fearing that the walking dude will turn on him, drives out into the desert saying he's going to go find something. So they've given him a motivation for running off and looking for the thing that he gets for the end of the script. So that's an interesting change. The pile of bombs is just too funny. Back in Vegas, the walking dude looks in on Lloyd, who is in bed with Dana, because he's looking in from, he's doing his naked meditation thing in the penthouse, and he's, looking at them through the bird. And she's down there. Apparently she's already gotten to Las Vegas, because apparently you can get from Boulder to Las Vegas on a bicycle in about 3 days. You see what I mean? How this doesn't really work? Like, it's weird that they're like infiltrating like they were doing as spies, but then they're also part of the Stand, which I don't think this really adds up. And this was a really funny moment, because he heads down there knowing that she's with Mother Abigail's, questioning her about who else has been sent to him. She tries to stab him with a knife hidden up her sleeve, but he transforms it into a banana, which just makes me think of Alan Rickman in Dogma turning the baseball bat into a big fish. What are you going to do? Hit me with that fish. And Dana then breaks the window and cuts her own throat, which is basically what she does in the book. And this enrages the walking dude, who gets angry and starts shouting at Lloyd and all that. And so Lloyd is kind of, losing his faith in the walking dude himself at this point. And meanwhile, Stu and Larry, they're crossing the desert together. And they find like a cat. This is a really kind of cool character moment for Larry because they pass like a cast off like an RV, and there's a guitar inside, and Larry starts playing the guitar, and he plays his song, Baby Can You Dig Your Man, on it. And because the song plays on the radio multiple times before any of these characters get together before the world ends, and Stu's like, hey, I know that song. You know who wrote it? And Larry says, nope, I don't. And he puts the guitar down. So he's given up his fame, essentially. Like, he doesn't care anymore, which I think is a nice character moment. And then while they're sleeping, he has a vision of rock star success because the walking dude's bird sits on the guitar and plucks the strings, which is a very awesome kind of audio visual thing. And then back in Vegas, the walking dude praises Lloyd for getting 3 more planes airborne, some with missiles, saying he'll have to take trash back in when he gets back. And there was a discussion earlier where they bring up the whole, like, our pilot school's going very good, and Flag goes, rush them through. And so the walking dude then attends to Nadine, and a massive clawed hand, very Freddy Krueger-like, seems to push briefly out of her abdomen before receding again. So they're doing some different stuff with the pregnancy here, and I actually kind of dig it. Stu and Larry, they're within sight of Vegas when they come across a crevice blocking the road, and Stu leaps over it, but he trips and falls and breaks his leg. And Larry makes the leap with no problem and tells Stu to stay there, figuring, I'm the one who's been chosen. You were only here to get me this far. So this is very much so. The script is basically making Larry's sacrifice the focal point of the ending, which I think is a really interesting idea. And Larry walks into Vegas, spotted from the distance by Tom on his bike, and he's welcomed at the MGM Grand by Lloyd, who says that Larry will play a concert tomorrow night. Then at the crevice, Kojak appears and helps Stu, fetching him a stick to splint his leg with. And while Stu makes an effort to climb out of the crevice using his gun as a tool to dig handholds, Larry is taken to an arena near the MGM Grand where the concert is underway, opening with a religious woman getting quartered by 4 cars, which holy fuck would that be brutal to see, especially with 80s gore effects. And then the walking dude himself and Nadine attend in person. Larry is brought on stage and told that in order to stay alive, he has to reject Mother Abigail. And he instead says that she taught him to fear no evil, and he implores the people of Vegas to not fear the walking dude, who grabs the microphone away only for it to make that shrieking feedback that he mentioned earlier when he tries to use it. And Stu keeps climbing out, and Tom keeps pedaling on his bike outside the arena, while Larry is attached to the cars and threatened with quartering if he doesn't recant. And Larry fights through the pain, refusing to give in, and this reaches Lloyd, who turns on his master, saying, "This is wrong. I may be a killer, but I'm also American, and this isn't American." And so they've kind of combined him with this character. His name was Whitney something or other, who was the doubter of Randall Flagg in the book, and Lloyd was the believer. They kind of mixed the two together, so they've given Lloyd a bit of a different arc here. And so the walking dude forms a ball of blue fire, which seals Lloyd's mouth shut. Very Twilight Zone the movie, or The Matrix even. And he threatens the crowd with the fireball, asking who wants to speak up. And meanwhile, Tom, after almost getting run over by this huge industrial forklift, which was heading for the arena, he senses something and pedals away. The forklift crashes into the arena, driven by Trash, who is suffering from radiation sickness, and a nuclear bomb he found for the walking dude. And then the dude, who is turning transparent and then back again, another cool little image, tries to talk Trash into leaving with it. Then he tries to tell Lloyd to give him an order, but Lloyd can't because his mouth is shut. And Larry, who has slipped from the ropes, berates him about his magic turning against him, and the fireball has grown out of control, and it sets off all the electric devices in Vegas. Car alarms are going off, slot machines are going off, spotlights are turning on, lights are blinking. It's like the opening of The Fog, with everything going crazy in the town on a grand scale. And then Tom keeps pedaling, heading for the crevice to warn Stu, who has managed to climb out. And Nadine, sensing that the walking dude's powers are waning, rips his baby out of herself. Holy crap, that takes some balls. Which is monstrous in appearance, and it speaks the word dada before dying. It's like, ooh, I like that little addition. That is so cool. Ugh, so fucked up. And then the walking dude transforms into a demonic form before disappearing, his clothes standing up for a moment before collapsing. And then the fireball sets off the nuke, which consumes Las Vegas. And Tom madly pedals for the crevice, his hair getting set on fire as he gets there, which, if you're close enough to that blast that's setting your hair on fire, you are fucked. I don't care how much God is looking after you. You are fucked. So that's something you can maybe change. Tom, Stu, and Kojak are safe in the crevice from the blast, and the fallout is blown west, meaning Boulder will be safe. So yeah, that's one thing I kind of have an issue with here, is the way they kind of put the crevice right outside Vegas. You can have this dramatic thing with Tom Cullen pedaling away from the city. there's a certain synchronicity to what the book does where he gets sent ahead earlier, and him having to leave when he does is what puts him in the right place to help Stu when Stu needs help. That is just, there's such a nice synchronicity to that kind of changing that is a little but you're condensing stuff down you kind of need to. I don't think the third act with the combining the spies and the stand fully works, and this is a little odd too. And so Stu and Tom make their way back through the snow. Franny and the now noticeably pregnant Lucy discover what they should name their kids, and Leo, having sensed what happened, says it should be Larry if it's a boy and Dana if it's a girl. And Franny's birth goes well, and Stu arrives just in time to see her holding the baby in the hospital, and it's a boy, so they name him Larry, which is a different from the book, because in the book she named it Peter after her father. Her father's not a character in the script, so they can't do that, so this change makes sense. And sometime later, they pack up the car to leave, and they say goodbye to Lucy, Leo, and some other people from Boulder, and there's this really corny line where they're like, "It's been such a journey, we've learned so much," and it's like what? And Leo says, "Like, we can't help being happy." Like, oh, that closing line is just bad. And they leave Boulder, they drive away, and it ends. So yeah, this first draft, pretty damn solid. I think there's some problems here and there that are just kind of natural when it comes to condensing a book of this size into a movie that's under 3 hours. I feel like if it had a little more space to work with, maybe it wouldn't have had so many problems. But it would have been a pretty good movie as it stands. I probably would have liked this a little bit better than the actual miniseries that we got back then. So yeah, I think Rospo Pallenberg did a damn good job with this for the most part. And he wrote at least 3 drafts. I have the second draft, which is dated March 1990. And that one is 135 pages as opposed to the 149 of this. And it's condensed a bit. Flag is actually called Flag. There's a couple of things that are gone. And at the ending, instead of like the whole driving away thing, that whole conversation happens in the hospital while Stu is holding the baby in his arms. So that's different. But overall, it was the same. Like, all the major beats are the same. All the major scenes are the same. And he did a third draft, which I don't have. And I only know it exists because it came up on, I found it on this iCollector page where it was packaged along with a signed copy of the book. And it's a third draft that has 144 pages, and it's dated January 1991. So he was working on it as late as that. And this draft, it pleased the producers. Richard Rubenstein liked it, probably liked it so much he wouldn't let them make a Blu-ray of the movie. If you know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. And he was happy with it because he said he felt that Pallenberg managed to get some distance from the material to make the necessary changes, which Stephen King wasn't able to do. And it was really good. It pleased Rubenstein, and it pleased the studio more or less. And supposedly Robert Duvall was attached to play the walking dude. And then Warner Brothers eventually passed on it. And ABC, who had some success with the 1990 It miniseries, they approached Stephen King to do The Stand, and he didn't have much involvement with it, but he decided to, do the teleplay for The Stand himself, which was a success, and that led to the whole phenomena of the Stephen King miniseries in the 90s. And not really a whole lot was heard of adapting The Stand again until much, much later. So the idea of a Stand movie didn't really come back again until 2011, because what happened was Warner Brothers, they picked up the rights again, and now the rights to this thing are very, very strange to me, because ABC made the miniseries, and yet somehow the film and TV rights ended up with CBS. Now, I haven't done the research to really figure that out yet, what that means or how the heck that happened, but that's very strange to me. And so Warner Brothers, they cut a deal with CBS and to make a movie, because Warner Brothers, this is in that period, this is 2011, where Harry Potter was wrapping up and they were panicking because they didn't have that to rely on as their tentpole every summer. So they were trying all these different things. Like Man of Steel wasn't out yet, so DC was kind of up in the air, and they knew Nolan's Batman was ending the very next year, so they were looking at a bunch of different things. And I remember right around that time reading that they were going to do The Stand as a trilogy. And the very first people they went to were the Harry Potter guys, David Yates and Steve Kloves. And they stayed attached to it for a little bit, but they eventually let it go, just saying that we don't know how to do this as a movie. So it's kind of unclear as to what Warner Brothers specifically asked for from them, if they wanted a movie or several movies. But chatter at the time suggested that they wanted a trilogy. And so they left, and eventually Ben Affleck signed on to direct for Warner Brothers. Now, he came into it, and this takes us up to around 2012. And he had just done, I think Argo had just come out or was about to come out, and he was kind of one of Warner Brothers' golden boys. And he ends up bringing in David Kajganich to write the script. Now, Kajganich is a guy who we covered one of his scripts on here before. We did the version of It that he had done at Warner Brothers, which was not terrible exactly. It was just very much fettered by the fact that it was trying to adapt that entire book and both time frames into a single 2-hour and a bit movie. And that was a studio note that Kajganich had gotten, but the studio was so impressed with what he turned in on that they gave him this job. And he eventually ended up turning in his first draft in May of 2013. Let me check this because I've got that one. It was May 17th, 2013 is when the first draft was turned in. Now, what's important to note is that when he was hired to write a 2-part movie. I've read interviews with him talking about this. And what happened is that he outlined it as 2 movies and started writing it as 2 movies, and he got halfway through the first draft of part 1 when Warner Brothers changed their mind and decided that they wanted 1 movie. And so he said, can I do this? And he went back and he decided, yes, I can make this work, and wrote it as 1 movie. And so that's the version that I have 2 copies of. The first draft, like I said, was May 17th, 2013. And the version I'm going to be looking at is his first polish from September 16th of 2013. It's a little bit longer and there's a little bit more stuff in it, so I decided to look at this one instead. There's not a huge number of differences between them from what I remember. They're both pretty much the same. Like, this one is like, the first draft is 152 pages. This one's 160 pages. Like, there's one little thing at the end I remember being different between the 2, but that's about it. But I'm going to focus on the polish. I'm not going to talk about the first draft. And like pretty much any version of The Stand you're going to read or see, it all follows the same basic outline of the superflu escaping and has the same basic cast of characters showing up. And the whole good versus evil thing, the split between Boulder and Las Vegas, Mother Abigail and Randall Flagg. All that happens here, but this is quite a significant reworking of the material, and you'll see as we go along. So it opens with Randall Flagg walking out of the desert and into the city of Las Vegas. He makes his way to the Luxor Casino to a blackjack table, and the dealer is Lloyd Henreid, and as they talk, Flagg intimates that he knows about Lloyd's criminal past, and changes the cards he's been dealt, turning them blank at first before making an eye appear on each one. He says that something is coming soon and says he's going to offer Lloyd a job. So right off the bat, not only are we opening in a different place from any of the previous versions, but we've also significantly changed the nature of the relationship between these two. So I think that kind of hurts Lloyd as a character a bit here. And because this ends up going into a very, very different direction as it goes along, we don't really get any sense of that loyalty like the way you did in the book and even the way you did in the Pallenberg Draft. So that's a change here. Although that is a pretty cool introduction to Randall Flagg, him just walking out of the desert and making his presence known like this. It's pretty cool. And from there we go to Arnett, Texas, where Stu Redman and a few of his friends are getting off work at the local steel mill. And there's talk of hours being cut and how everyone is heading to Haps that night. And Stu drives through town, and there's Christmas decorations visible in the windows of stores. So this is a Christmas script, so releasing this episode in December makes perfect sense. And he drives through town, and this scene is set to White Room by Cream, so cool song there. And later on at Haps, Texaco, there's talk among the men with mentions of the mill possibly shutting down and how they need to get rid of the mayor. And they suggest Stu for the job, and he goes, I wouldn't want to be the mayor, I just want to go hunting. So that's a nice little foreshadowing to stuff later on. And that's when a station wagon comes speeding along and hits the pumps, and the driver, who is called Charles Campion in this version, is dripping mucus and rambling madly, and his wife and child are dead in the car, also dripping mucus. And there's a California license plate and a Fort Irwin Army base pass on the back, but no signs of anything else, and he dies not long after. The EMTs pick up the bodies, and Stu heads home to his cabin, which he has under renovation, and is met by his dog. And all I could think of when he's talking about his cabin, how he's fixing up the roof, all I could think of was Gene Hackman from Unforgiven, how he's a shitty carpenter and his house is leaking all over the place. It reminded me of that for some reason. Like, I keep expecting in the face of the superflu for Stu to go, I don't deserve this. I was building a house. And from there we go to Fort Irwin, where Colonel Starkey arrives amidst news teams, is met by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton after receiving a gas mask. So here we are getting, more of that military background that was in the book, and that wasn't in the Pallenberg Draft. That was kind of all crunched out, but we're getting a little bit more of that here. And Creighton informs him of the situation that an experimental virus got out and that it was all contained except for Campion, who managed to flee thanks to a glitch in the maglock, so nothing locked down for a very specific period of time, and he was able to get away. And they then receive a report of Campion's death in Texas, and they realize they spread it too far to contain, and in all probability someone heading to an airport to holiday travel might have picked it up as well. I find that really interesting, the way it uses holiday travel as the super spreader for Captain Trips in this, the super flu. I think that's a really interesting, smart idea, because you hear about that. This year we're definitely hearing about that, but beforehand I would hear about how, because I would fly for the holidays, and I would hear about how, colds and stuff would spread through, and flu and stuff would spread through travelers. Because, you would hear about that quite a bit, at least I would. So I thought that was a neat little addition to this. And so they've shifted the time frame because the time frame of the book and of the Pallenberg Draft, it goes from early summer of the year and into early next year in winter. And depending on which version of the book, it's a different year. The original hardback was 1980, the original paperback was 85, and then the extended version was 1990. Also, there's a bit where Starkey is looking at, what's going on down in the sealed, infected area over cameras, and he sees that there's a centrifuge that keeps spinning because it was never turned off. That's a motif for later. And we go to Stu, who dreams of the Rocky Mountains and Mother Abigail's voice saying his name before waking up to a call from Hap. And also he sees a mountain it's a very specific mountain that he sees, and that's important later. Hap explains that everyone who was at the crash is now sick, that some are hospitalized, and that he can't reach Norm, who was one of the guys who was there. And Stu finds that his dog has died from it and thoroughly washes himself off in the shower. And he heads into town to look for Norm, finding him choking on his own mucus in back of his store. And that was like just nice little, kind of scary little moment there. And so we go to Vegas. Flagg and Lloyd sit and talk in a drainage culvert not far from the Luxor. And Flagg explains that he has no memories from before 2 weeks ago, but thinks he must have been a carpenter due to the splinters and varnish on his hands at the time. That's an interesting point. The idea that Flagg was someone else before events turned and made him come forward like this, that maybe Flagg is, controlling someone else's body. That's the implication that's made here, and that's a pretty interesting idea to me. And he says he's going back to the desert to psychically broadcast his thoughts, something he already tested by sending Lloyd a dream, and forms a pyramid with his hands, shooting out a small beacon of light, which is basically mimicking the light on top of the Luxor Hotel. And back with Stu, he's checked himself into the hospital, where things are getting very bad, even seeing a man get handed a respirator, so that's kind of, considering current events. He's met by a CDC doctor named Denninger, who tells Stu that he's infected but not showing any symptoms. He wants Stu to come with him to a secure facility on Long Island where they can study his immunity, playing on his military record to get him to agree, because we see that he has like a Marines tattoo or something to that effect, the idea that he was in the military, so he basically playing on the idea that he would want to help his country. Stu wants to check on his friends first, but Denninger tells him that they're all already dead and that more cases are coming in frequently. Stu agrees and is flown out of there on the plane. From the window, he sees Arnett being surrounded by a military blockade, which alarms him. So here they've taken out the idea of everybody from there getting taken out along with him. They're just taking him because they've already realized he's immune. And here the superflu is spreading even faster. Like, it seems to be spreading like really quickly compared to the other versions of the story. And we then get a montage of people gathering at various events and places, as well as traveling, and basically saying this is the last days on Earth of like regular human activity. And it's set to the end by the doors, at least that's because it's called This Is the End montage, and so I figured that's what they were doing. It ends with a shot of Flagg's eye hovering in the sky over Las Vegas. Whether or not it's followed by the CSI intro, I'll leave that up to you to decide. And we go to a hungover Larry Underwood who's waking up on a flight to New York, and the woman sitting next to him recognizes him as an American Idol contestant. So yeah, they've updated him to a current pop culture reference, and so there's no Baby Can You Dig Your Man in the script, unfortunately. And it's actually kind of funny because the woman says, hey, I'm actually rooting for that little girl, by the way, not you. When they flirt, eventually ending up having sex in the bathroom. I don't know how you do that in an airplane bathroom, because those things are tiny. Like, I don't even know how you fit 2 people in there, let alone fucking one. But, it's not important. Let's just leave that there. As they come out, they watch as another plane almost hits them before crashing into the ground. So a little post-apocalyptic carnage, which there's a fair bit of in this script, almost to the point where it's like you're just sticking random action beats in here, aren't you? And they arrive at LaGuardia Airport, where everything is in chaos thanks to all flights being grounded. Basically, they can land, but they can't take off, and everybody seems to be sick. And Larry just leaves the woman there, and she's pissed off, saying, oh, yeah, you're no nice guy, blah, blah, blah. So that line comes back. And Stu arrives at the lab on Long Island. It's on a little island off the main island. And he's ushered to a sealed observation room. He's not happy about this, and while trying to explain his position to a doctor named Dietz, begins to pick up on the virus being man-made. And he tries to leave the room only to get tased by the National Guardsman who's on duty there. We go back to Fort Irwin. Starkey, who he takes the elevator down to the infected area in his despair. He decides to go turn off the centrifuge, and then he blows his brains out in full view of Creighton, who's watching on the cameras, and that's the last we get of that subplot. And we then go to a basketball arena at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where Flagg has begun to gather followers who saw him in their dreams. So this is moving really quickly with a bunch of plot threads, because the dreams don't really take over too much until after the plague is kind of spread. Like, there's a little bit of, there's a slow build up to it because this whole thing is crammed into one movie like this. It's like the way Kajganich has kind of expedited some of these things. He's bringing these plot threads of Randall Flagg and the dreams super early, and so he's kind of running them parallel to each other, which is an interesting way to do it. He then gives a display of his powers, levitating 2 feet above the center line and doing complicated juggling of several basketballs, which is just kind of silly. We then go to Stu's dream, where he's struggling in the waters of the Colorado River before getting shot out at the Hoover Dam, but instead of falling, he floats up into the sky where he sees the lights of Vegas, including the light atop the Luxor, turn on as he hears Flagg's voice asking him to join him. And that's the first half hour of the movie right there, guys. That's 30 pages. That's 30 minutes of movie going by the page-to-minute method. At least in theory, that's how much time would pass in the movie. It doesn't always work out like that. And Stu awakens in the observation room, and it's clearly been a while based on the state of his stubble, and he's full of needle marks from where they've drawn blood. Elder, who's the orderly, enters, clearly infected, and he tries to force Stu to transfuse his blood into him with a taser, but they fight, and Stu knocks the taser out of his hands. It falls under the bed as just out of Stu's reach, but it jumps into his hand, and Stu uses it to knock Elder out. So we're seeing a bit of special powers here have been added into the script, which there's a little bit of that in the book, a very small amount. But this script kind of takes that idea and just runs with it, which is something I'm not sure how I feel about, especially way at the end of the script when we get there. He wanders out into the hallway, finding a male nurse who says that Stu is the only living patient before Stu takes some keys from him. And this is actually a really well executed scene, which is a little bit more like the book than the Pallenberg's version is, where he's making his way through the dark hospital full of bodies. He gets chased by an infected man who's running around on all fours before escaping the building, and he finds that it's now summer. Because it was Christmas time when he went in, and now it's summer, so quite a few months have passed. Stu rows across to the mainland of Long Island, and in a montage, gathers supplies and crosses the island using a cast-off moped until it breaks down in Brooklyn. And as he gets closer to the city, there are more and more bodies in the streets. He goes across the Brooklyn Bridge, wreathed in fog, and this is actually kind of a cool visual scene. And he's crossing the bridge, and this huge freighter ship comes drifting in down the East River, and he has to run for the other side before it hits. And he makes it just inside as the ship hits the center span, taking out the bridge. So not a bad idea for a scene, but kind of a pointless action scene when you really think about it. Like, it's just kind of like you could cut this out without too much problem, save the movie a few $1 million. You know, there is that. And on the other side, Stu finds a wall has been erected, and climbing it comes across a huge pile of bodies on the other side who are all gunned down trying to escape Manhattan. There's a lot of really good post-apocalyptic imagery of Manhattan here, and yes, I should say they have completely changed around the locations of certain things. Like Stu here gets sent to Long Island instead of New England, and we're having him kind of experience the post-apocalyptic New York that Larry Underwood does, and it works okay for a script. I'm not convinced that it's a great adaptation, though. Like, that's the thing with the script, is that it's well written, well executed on its own terms, but just thinking about how it twists the source material, it's very difficult to swallow. And he climbs down into Manhattan, and he comes across a crazed drag queen, Bruce, you moron, called the Monster Shouter, who only says that monsters are coming as he loots the bodies, and that's the character who, for some reason, is played by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in the original miniseries, and I think, is it supposed to be Marilyn Manson playing that role in the new one? I'm not sure. I thought Marilyn Manson was playing Trash Can Man, but then it turned out that was Ezra Miller, which is, I mean, he's known for playing edgy roles like that, but that kind of took me by surprise. And in another montage, Stu makes his way across Manhattan, seeing all the death and destruction firsthand, and he visits the Metropolitan Museum of Art looking at the paintings. He specifically sees a painting of the Madonna and Child, which is important for a dream sequence later. And he camps out at the Temple of Dendur for the night, which is this Egyptian temple which was gifted to the United States, and they placed it in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's on like a pool of water. And that really is there, and Will Smith visits in I Am Legend. In fact, the way post-apocalyptic New York is kind of described in this script, I'm like, was Kajganich watching that version of I Am Legend and going like, ooh, let's do that? I can't help but think of that. And here, Stu dreams of Mother Abigail, seeing her in person this time at her homestead in Colorado, which is a change, but that's where they say it is here. She tells him that he will play the deciding role in what's to come, and it's mentioned that Flagg is called out but doesn't know his name. And Stu says he's just a nobody, but Mother Abigail tells him that he's bigger than he realizes and says to meet her on the Lincoln Highway, and he awakes. Now, the Lincoln Highway, I actually had to look this up. This is a neat little addition by Kajganich, because the Lincoln Highway is the first official coast-to-coast highway in the United States that was first founded in 1913, I think it was. And it's changed somewhat since then. It's kind of fallen out of use ever since the numbered highway system that we put together in like the interstates and stuff later on in the 20th century. But it still is there, and the route has changed significantly over time. But it's a real thing that you can take from New York to San Francisco. And it's kind of a neat little addition here. Like, it has like a very mythic kind of quality to it, which fits the stand. And the next day, Stu sets out, finding the eastern terminus of the highway in Times Square, and as he's about to follow it out of the city, the Monster Shouter walks by, only to get his throat slit by a teenager and his fellow gang members, and they're described as being like, looking like prep school kids. And they seem to be running things in that area, and they chase Stu, who psychically knocks knives out of the hands of two of them before fleeing for the Lincoln Tunnel, and a bus suddenly falling from the street above and cutting off the gang members. And this alerts Flagg, who is overseeing the burning of bodies at McCarran Airport in Las Vegas, telling Lloyd he thinks he has a brother out there. I've never had a brother, Lloyd. So yes, Flagg is very specifically interested in Stu Redman in this script because of the whole psychic abilities thing that's been expounded upon here. And Stu traverses the Lincoln Tunnel on the footpaths, so they've given him Larry Underwood's thing from the book, singing to himself, and he first sings the Cream song White Room that he was listening to earlier. Then he realizes that's a bit too bleak and scary in terms of lyrics, so he switches to something else, which was pretty funny. And he steps over a dead body, and he has to climb over a pile of dead bodies, and on top he comes across a woman who slit her own throat. And he loses his flashlight in the process, breaking it, and he has to rely on his cigarette lighter, and starts hearing noises as if someone is following him. He eventually finds Larry Underwood trapped in the back of a police cruiser and coming down from a high, and Stu drags Larry with him, and they emerge from the tunnel into New Jersey. And we then go to Stu's dream, where Flagg, who now knows his name, offers him a place with him in Las Vegas, and Stu turns him down, and Flagg, who is wearing a black bird mask, tells him he will die. And this image it's meant to be, we find out this way, way later in the script, but it's meant to be an homage to the cover art of the original edition of the book, which was those two guys fighting, one of whom had a bird face. That's what that is, and the explanation for that is later, but I figured I'd point that out now. And Stu sees the Madonna painting from the Met, only with the Monster Shouter holding Stu's severed head in his lap, and he wakes up. Okay, that's a pretty cool dream image right there. And he's in a Port Authority building with Larry, who wakes up soon afterward. And he mentions that he tried crossing the tunnel with a woman named Rita, who couldn't take it and cut her throat open. And that was the woman Stu found earlier, and they jumped into the cop car to hide, but got stuck there with only the drugs in his pockets. So yeah, Larry Underwood here, a lot of his character has kind of been gutted for this script. Like the whole, you get introduced to the whole he's not a nice guy thing, but a lot of his development is just not here. Like it just sort of happens that he becomes a better person. Like the whole Rita Blakemore thing means so much more in the source material, and here it's just kind of like, it's this thing that happened to me. The whole thing with his mother is gone. His whole situation in Los Angeles is gone because they made him an American Idol contestant. And so it's a shame that this is kind of, it detracts from what things that would make it a better story. Larry then mentions that he's had the dreams of Mother Abigail as well, and off Stu's confusion explains about how things went bad in the city and then people started dreaming. And he also says that specific mountain that's in the dreams is right outside Boulder, Colorado, so that's where they need to head. And Stu mentions that's right off the Lincoln Highway, and after discussing this for a bit, they head off riding on pristine motorcycles they looted from a dealership. I have to point out this technically isn't correct, because it would be right on the Lincoln Highway, but the loop through that goes down through Colorado and then back up to Wyoming, that's part of the highway, that was taken off of it like decades ago, so technically it's not part of the Lincoln Highway anymore. I guess they're going for the old school route here, but it doesn't get anywhere near Boulder in reality, not anymore. That's what happens when you get interested and you do your own research. And so they discuss this for a bit. They head off riding on pristine motorcycles they looted from a dealership. And we then go to Powtonville, Ohio, where Donald Merwin Elbert, a.k.a. Trash or the Trash Can Man, is met by a boy named Daryl who takes him to his grandmother, Mrs. Yates, who remembers Trash and his firebug habits from before and berates him for burning stuff in mailboxes and all that. And she drives him off. As a Trash blows up an SUV, severely wounding the woman, and continues on his way. And so that scene is just, because this is so compressed, you have characters vomiting out backstory, which happened a little bit in the Pallenberg script, and happens a little bit here. But in this case, it's a completely different character vomiting out a character's backstory. A character who only shows up to do that and then get glass embedded in her face. Very strange choice. And there's mention that, he was locked up in the mental hospital here, but they started letting everyone out once people started getting sick. So that, again, is addressed here. We then go back to Stu and Larry traveling across the Lincoln Highway. Traveling Lincoln Highway across Pennsylvania in a montage. The script loves its montages. This thing might actually have more montages than Rocky IV, come to think of it. Seriously, if you actually count the montages, well, not only is this a much, much longer movie than Rocky IV, but there's 17 montages in this thing compared to Rocky IV's 5 or 6. It's kind of hilarious. But I like montages, so I don't mind it. I actually like the montages in Rocky IV. They come across a message left on the side of a barn by Harold Loudner, so there's an N added to his name, and Fran Goldsmith saying they're heading for Boulder. So yeah, I like that we get that little hint of the characters, that we get the whole billboard thing before we meet them. That's a cool little way to cover over the fact that they're not getting introduced until much, much later. And Stu looks over at a crashed Amish carriage with dead horses, and after seeing a flash of the Luxor Pyramid, has a vision of the horses getting back up. And I should say that moving Flag's base of operations from the MGM Grand, which I think it was in the book, it was in the Pallenberg Draft, and moving it to the Luxor is actually a really cool idea because, the pyramids were built by people who thought they were gods, and Flag obviously thinks he's on par with a god. I think that's a nice little visual motif for the character. Putting him in the pyramid makes sense. And this is interrupted by the barking of a dog, and Kojak runs out and starts licking Stu's face. He's followed by Glenn Bateman, who made the cut for this draft, who asks if they're heading for Boulder or Vegas, and when they answer the former, well, he actually says Vegas or heaven, which was a strange choice of words. He signals his companions, Nadine and the mute boy they call Joe. We then go to Harold and Franny in Indiana, where Harold is painting a message on a billboard, and Franny is 7 months pregnant, and this scene follows where we kind of hash out their relationship and their backstory. Harold says, let's get married, and she says she doesn't want to do it just because it would be more convenient with the baby coming along. They kind of go back and forth, and we get the idea that Harold has this kind of, fraught backstory with him getting bullied by Franny and her friends, and now they're kind of stuck together. And it's what's really, really interesting about this scene is it's taking the whole idea of painting on signs, which is they do in the book. And so it mashes together a couple of different scenes. There's some Harold dialogue from the book, and it is mentioned that he used to be It is mentioned here that he's fat, but not as fat as he used to be, and his clothes don't really fit anymore. That was a neat little note for the effect of the post-apocalyptic setting on him. He's also a bit more humanized in this. Like he's nowhere near as like psychotic as Harold gets in the book. Like here, he's much more conflicted. But what's interesting about this scene is that they've taken like the painting scene, and they've also put together with the scene from the book where Franny is introduced talking to her boyfriend after she finds out that she's pregnant, and the whole "let's get married" thing comes from that. And they also flip around some of the dialogue because he responds to her in that scene in the book with "oh hell," and then he says, "don't I get to say anything?" Because she said, "You did. You had your chance, but you said oh hell," which they flip around and they give the "oh hell" to Franny. And the "you had your chance, but you said, oh, hell," they give that to Harold here. Very interesting the way he put this together. Now, this is something where it works to get the message of the scene across and what their relationship is. But what's really strange about it is that if you saw this movie and didn't know anything about the source material, it wouldn't jump out at you. If you've read the book and know the book, it will immediately jump at you, and you're just seeing where things have been cut and pasted together. Like, it worked, but it doesn't work. It's a very strange scene. And they then react to the sound of approaching motorcycles, and this is the 60-page mark, so there's about 100 pages left in this thing. That's the hour mark of the movie is when we meet these two main characters. Kind of pushing it, to be honest, but it is a thing with adapting The Stand, especially as one movie. There's so many characters. And back in Pennsylvania, the group have all camped out for the night, with Glenn talking about how some people he ran into in Scranton, whether or not they work for Dunder Mifflin, is up in the air. I mean, honestly, I could totally see Creed Bratton being one of the survivors of Captain Trips, let's be honest. Now, they split between Boulder and Vegas, explaining how with the dam nearby, electricity will be on sooner, and along with Flag being charismatic and appealing to some degree, that makes Vegas seem like the more appealing option almost, because you won't have to deal with the snow that you would in Boulder. And I like a lot of the discussions here about, the pros and cons of the two different places and the way they're used here. There's a really interesting one regarding Vegas later on, which I'll talk about. But I do like the way they use Glenn Bateman here. And after Larry unsuccessfully flirts with Nadine, they all discuss the dreams and psychic abilities of Glenn, a physicist, comparing it to particles interacting over a distance. So he's not a sociologist here, he's a physicist. It's really funny because they have the line where he says he's a professor and Stu says a sociologist. He says, no, a physicist, but he says something about how like the circumstances kind of pushed me in that direction, which I thought was kind of funny. And they test their powers out by like someone will think of something and they'll draw it on a piece of paper. And some of them are closer than others. Stu draws it the most clearly. He's the most tuned in, and Nadine just isn't, no one can actually reach her, which is, and the way this scene is written weirdly right now, I didn't think of it until this moment. It reminds me of Rose Red, because there's a scene where they test out the automatic writing powers of that woman in Rose Red. It reminded me of that. And meanwhile, over an hour into the movie, we meet our two final main characters here. The deaf-mute Nick Andros. He crosses over from Arkansas to Missouri, biking into a town called Palmyra, where he meets the Down syndrome-afflicted Tom Cullen, who doesn't fully understand everything that's happened. He knows that his mother and his one neighbor, they're dead, but he thinks everybody else went to St. Louis, because apparently people have been leaving town for a while because Palmyra is such a small town and people are leaving for the city. And it's interesting that they specifically say he has Down syndrome here, because I don't think they specify that in the book. I think that's an elaboration by Kajganich here, but it is an interesting one. And he says so Nick tries to introduce himself with a piece of paper, and he says he can't read MOON. That spells can't read. So we do get that little catchphrase of his in here a couple times, which is nice. And like what I said about the Pallenberg Draft, it helps seeing these two meet each other to get an idea of what their relationship is like. So it helps having this scene in here. And we go back to Stu's group as they cross Indiana, with Glenn explaining that tech people will determine the future because they're going to be the ones who are able to turn everything back on. And they also test their powers again, with Stu still the best and Nadine still completely unreachable. And they come across the sign Harold was painting, but it's unfinished and the paint is dry, which disconcerts them. And there was a mention earlier that he hid the paint cans in the shade so that they wouldn't explode in the heat, and now they're sitting out. So they say that that's a bad sign too. And back in Palmyra, Nick and Tom spend the night in the town band shell. And Tom has this huge collection of Matchbox cars that he's playing around with, which I thought was pretty cute. We go back to Stu's group, and they find that the highway has flooded, which according to Glenn is due to the pumps on the Chicago River going off, which caused Lake Michigan to overflow, and it reaches them where they are, 10 miles away from where the shore normally is. And I like the thought that's been put into the post-apocalyptic world here. Like, that kind of detail I think is really neat. As they cross, Larry finds a guitar amongst the wreckage, and Stu has a vision of the masked flag appearing and the dead rising from the water to attack. Stu wants them to leave him behind as too dangerous, but they all refuse to abandon him, and which is a nice little group sort of dynamic moment. And in Palmyra, Nick awakes and checks his map for possible routes to the Lincoln Highway, and he decides he's going to take Tom along with him. And like what it's doing is it's faking you out to think maybe he's not going to, but you know he's going to make the right choice, especially if you've read the material. And back with the main group, they're camped out at a drive-in theater, and Larry starts playing the guitar, which gets a word out of Joe, welcome. And so Joe starts talking more and more. He never, reveals his real name in this version, which I thought was an interesting choice. And they are then visited by Trash, who says he's camping on a nearby golf course and asks for some food. He leaves after he gets it, but, the weirdness of the trash can man, pushes Stu to decide that they need to set a watch. Larry takes first watch, and Nadine keeps him company, and she talks about preferring the world the way it is now, but when Larry kisses her, she backs off and returns to her tent. And soon after, Larry spots Trash moving across the lot and follows him. From a hill overlooking the site, he spies Trash about to set an explosion at a group of petroleum storage tanks and runs to warn the others. The series of explosions are massive, but Stu manages to protect the group from shrapnel by forming a silver barrier around them. Trash watches the destruction from a railroad bridge and gets a message from Flag, who calls him by his real name and promises to place him highly. I like that detail that what makes Trash Can Man kind of listen to Flag is the fact that Flag refers to him by his real name and doesn't just call him Trash. I thought that was a nice little touch, a good idea. Larry finds Trash's tent and confiscates his weapons and explosives. And so back in Palmyra, Nick gets Tom a bike of his own and they head off, Tom leaving his home county for the first time, which was very Sam Gamgee going, this is the furthest away from home I've ever been. Not to say Sam Gamgee has Down syndrome, but okay, the Ralph Bakshi version of Sam Gamgee might have had Down syndrome, but you're leaving that aside. As the main group crosses over from Illinois to Iowa, Larry tries to talk to Nadine about what happened, but before he can finish, they run into a group of men holding a bunch of women, including Franny, and I don't even know why I specified Dana Jurgens here, because she never does a single other thing in this script other than be in this scene. Doped up on something, and Harold is also standing there with him, kind of off to the side. And the fight breaks out with some of the women helping out, and we find out some of the tranquilizers they were given didn't work right. And most of the men are killed, with two of them, Garvey and Verge, escaping in a car, and then Kojak runs off during the fight and he disappears here. This is a scene from the revised and expanded version of the book. This is where they meet Dana Jurgens and Susan Stern. Only they've kind of folded it together a little bit, and they have Franny and Harold here as well. And the way he's rewritten it, it doesn't feel out of place. It actually kind of works. The same goes with the petroleum explosion. That's Trash's introduction in the book. And they kind of folded it together with the rest of the journey. That actually kind of worked in this context. Like, I'm still kind of iffy about some of these changes, but in context, they kind of make sense. Larry is badly wounded, though, shot through the chest, and they take him to a meeting hall at a camp called River Dog. I mean, you might as well call it Camp Chippewa for all the point that name has. It looks like Larry won't make it, but Stu uses his powers to heal the wound, bringing him back from the brink, and he makes like a silver light when he uses his powers. Like, it's referred to as just, it's not really expounded upon, it's just like, it's just called the silver, which is kind of interesting. Meanwhile, Flag is searching the countryside for Stu and contact Garvey and Verge, as well as 3 other men, telling them to bring Stu to him. And back at the meeting hall, he's on the porch thinking about sneaking off to keep the rest safe, but Franny meets him and talks to him, saying that he saved both her and Harold, and she says he was being tested by the men to see what he would do, but if they had him do anything nasty, he wouldn't have been able to do it and wouldn't have lasted, and that he should reconsider. And we're at about page 90 here, and this part was so weird and ridiculous, I had to stop reading for a bit and catch my breath. Suddenly, 3 horses quickly approach the meeting hall porch and carry Stu away down the driveway, depositing him in the back of a truck, part of a convoy led by Garvey. Yes, Stu just got snatched off a porch by possessed horses. I know Stephen King had a reputation back in the 70s and 80s for being a massive cokehead and just on drugs all the time. This is not in the book. This was original to the script. It's almost like he was trying to capture that insanity of early Stephen King, and it's just weird. the possessed horse is dragging him off the porch by his belt and his shirt collar. What? It's just reminding me of the possessed deer from The Ring 2. Like, what the hell? And they keep Stu groggy with the tranquilizers used on the girls as they drive off. And it's mentioned that, like, the orange ones are good and the pink ones are bad and don't work, but they keep giving him both. So they've kind of cottoned on to that now. And Larry alerts the camp and tells the majority of the group to keep going on the highway and meet them at Hemingford Home, Nebraska, which is further on down along the road. And Larry grabs some grenades from Trash's supplies, and Larry, Glenn, and Harold set out on the motorcycles, and Larry using the power of the magic to track them. And they catch up, and there's a chase shootout ensues, complete with one bad guy firing off rocket launchers. This whole chase sequence is just, why? It's so dull to read this long extended action sequence in The Stand of all things. I was not a huge fan of this part. And during the chase, a tornado starts to form, which Stu sees the face of Flag inside. Eventually, Stu and Larry get the upper hand and flee to a nearby house for shelter. The door is locked, though, and Stu is too groggy to use his powers, and no one else is strong enough, only for the door to be opened by Nick Andros, who takes them down to the storm shelter, which still has dead bodies in it, which is just, ugh. The storm passes, leaving them unharmed, but Garvey survives, and back in Vegas, Flag is angry as hell at his failure, trashing the room he's in. The next morning, Tom makes his presence known, surprising Stu since he couldn't sense him in the dark, and Nick introduces the two of them with a note, and he says, "Please tell him my name's not Mister," which I thought was pretty funny. They meet back up with the rest of the group in Hemingford Home and start planning for when Garvey eventually comes back. Stu figures that with Flag sending people after them, they should send some of their own spies down to Vegas, and they eventually settle on Nadine and Tom as they're the hardest to sense, and Nadine knows the area from growing up there, and the two of them set out together the next day with the strong implication that Larry and Nadine slept together the night before, and the implication is Tom looking over at her and saying, "M-O-O-N, that spells hickey," and I'm like, who taught Tom Cullen what a hickey is? And so, yeah, with that little tidbit of information, Nadine's character is very different in this version, and we'll see more of that in a minute. And Stu senses that Mother Abigail is just an hour ahead of them up on the road, and sure enough, they find her with a group of people stopped by the roadside. She takes Stu off to the side and talks to him, saying that it'll be up to him to lead when they reach Boulder, and that a war for souls is about to commence, one that they need to win. And even though they're only 4 hours from Boulder, she says they'll stop for the night to rest for what's ahead. It's not long after that Garvey and a whole new group of men appear, but Mother Abigail, this was awesome. She just stands in the middle of the highway and stops them in their tracks. They get off their motorcycles, drop their weapons. He says, just keep on walking, and they keep on walking like they don't even see the people there. And she says, hey, they're going to be walking for 3 days before they realize it. And when Stu says, oh, they'll head for Vegas to tell Flag, she says, oh, by the time they get there, it'll all be over. So the time frame has very much been compressed based on this. They stop for the night in Big Spring, Nebraska, and Stu has Harold find a suitable meeting place to discuss their plans, and he picks out the Phelps Hotel before going to a nearby gas station and picking up some twine. The meeting proceeds in the hotel with Glenn talking about how Vegas, it's only a good option on the surface, but because it's a desert community, eventually, without the irrigation, it will be uninhabitable, which was a really smart thing to put in there because that never comes up in any other version. And I thought that was just a really neat idea. And it's mentioned that Flag will want to take Boulder eventually. Mother Abigail also mentions that Harold is conflicted on which side to join, that he's had plenty of dreams of both people, and suggests letting him leave if he wants to. So yeah, honestly, that's a bit weak. Like, it could have been interesting to see a little bit more of Harold's side of things, but once again, it's already 160 pages long and they're cramming it into under 3 hours. So that's something that kind of falls by the wayside in this version. Like, it would be more interesting to see more of that conflict. And Franny pulls out a chair that yanks the twine, which they immediately sense is connected to several grenades under the table set by Harold. And Mother Abigail takes the brunt of the explosion, using her power to contain it. And as she lays dying, passes her power on to Stu, saying that Flag wants what he has, but that he can take from Flag as well. And Harold sees that the explosion is not as big as it should be, and he drives off. Like, he's far away already, and he panics and drives off. And Harold, he has fled south into New Mexico, heading for Vegas. He gets down there really fucking quick from Nebraska. Like, they seem to get places. They're only 4 hours from Boulder, but apparently in the 4 hours between here and when they get there, he just, boom, gets all the way down to New Mexico. He gets picked up by the Kid, a crazed, gun-toting man who drives a NASCAR vehicle with a mannequin in the backseat who is heading the same way. Now, this character, the Kid, is from the revised expanded edition of the book, but it was Trash Can Man who runs into him, and they've kind of given this part of his story to Harold. Once again, a very odd little cut-and-paste job they've done here. And the man frightens Harold, but he doesn't have much of a choice because, his moped that he was on broke down. And we go back with the group. They load Mother Abigail's coffin into the back of a pickup truck filled with flowers, and they drive it to Boulder in a funeral procession montage, picking up cars along the way, with 30 of them following as they finally reach Boulder. Now that would have been really cool to see as a scene, this whole long funeral procession, and the flowers in the back of the pickup truck arriving in Boulder. That would have been a really interesting thing to see. Harold and the Kid hole up for the night in the abandoned motel, where the Kid shoots a non-functioning TV and makes Harold drink a beer, before forcing him to fuck the mannequin at gunpoint, which he has drilled holes into in order to do that, explaining how he plans to topple Flag once they reach Vegas. And the next morning, Harold finds a wolf sitting in the parking lot and approaches it, begging it to help him get away from the Kid, and licks his hands and face as an answer. And in this scene that is fucked up, but it's way less fucked up than what happens to Trash in the book, where he gets sodomized with the handgun and forced to blow the Kid. Like, holy shit. That scene's probably not going to be in the new miniseries. I guarantee it, even being on CBS All Access. Being on a streaming service, not going to happen. And back in Boulder, Mother Abigail's coffin is taken to Chautauqua Park and placed in the community hall where people file in to pay their respects. Stu talks with Franny upstairs, and she says that Glenn and Larry are out with groups gathering weapons at the police armory and at a nearby military base, and says that people will panic if Stu doesn't speak to them. Stu, on the other hand, voices his discomfort with Mother Abigail asking him to lead these people into a war. And so in Vegas, Flag has all the people gathered in the Luxor's card hall, which has been refurnished and resembles a megachurch. Nadine and Tom are there, and Flag asks all the newcomers to line up and meet him in person. And she notices that he's not only shaking hands, he's touching their head and doing something with the silver power, so she's a little bit worried. And knowing that she'll be found out anyways, attacks him with a box cutter, stabbing him in the throat. And Flag stops her from slitting it open and grabs her with his abilities, holding her up in the air and crushing her head until she dies. And she just manages to get a message out to Stu beforehand, though. He's mortal, it's time, and she also screams he's mortal to all the other people in the room. And Flag heals his wound and has her body strung up on a scaffold. So Nadine, completely different in this. Most of the other characters in here at least have some of the other traits from the book, at least resemble their character on the page. Nadine is just, aside from being with Joey and kind of having a thing with Larry, just is completely different. And there's another one who is just off in this script that we'll talk. You've probably kind of guessed who it is based on what I've been saying so far. But as we go along, there's some weird stuff they do with him that I'll talk about. And so the Kid arrives in Vegas with Harold not long after. And while Harold, who seems just completely out of it, is given the VIP treatment and sent up to his own little suite, so he gets that side of the Trash Can Man's character as well. The Kid is apprehended and crucified alongside Nadine's corpse. Now, if I remember the expanded version right, he gets killed by wolves outside a tunnel in the book. But this is a fine little change here. Back in Boulder, he gets crucified alongside Nadine's corpse. Back in Boulder, Stu has all the people gathered in the Chautauqua Auditorium. Before he speaks to them, he talks with Franny about his doubts, and they kiss for the first time. He then goes before the people, telling them that it's time to go to war with Flag. He gives a big speech and ends by psychically showing them both Mother Abigail's death and Nadine's and asking them to lend him some power. And so the Boulderites gather, 450 of them all together, and after Larry says goodbye to Joe, they form a convoy and head out for Vegas, with Stu using his powers to block them from Flag's vision. And meanwhile, Flag tells Trash to make a list of things he'll need and only show it to him. And the Boulder Army continues its trek southwest, eventually stopping at Zion National Park, where they discuss strategy. And this is where, even with all the differences before this point, this is where it just completely loses the plot for me, because it becomes a war movie at this point. Like, it becomes the battle between good and evil becomes a literal battle here, and it's just no. Like, this is just such a bizarre direction to take The Stand in, where ordinary people who couldn't do anything being the ones who influenced the ending is kind of the point. Making it a big, huge, pitched battle scene just seems strange. And from Nadine's mental message, Stu knows that Flag has 2 howitzers set up, one at Little Sister Peak to the north of the city and one on a hill called Fortification Hill near the Hoover Dam. And Larry will lead a group to take the dam, Nick will lead a team to Little Sister, and Glenn will lead the main group, with Franny in charge of the rear guard because she's pregnant. And Stu tells them to help anyone from Vegas willing to surrender and says that the battle will be a distraction as he plans to split off and sneak into Vegas on his own to kill Flag. And he doesn't want to say, how he's actually going to manage it because he figures it's best if only he knows. And they plan to shut the dam down long enough to make the Las Vegans panic, but they're saying we don't even need to hold it. We just need to keep the power turned off long enough for the panic to happen. And so the next morning, Stu sets off with Larry's group, eventually leaving on his own and following the Colorado River, swimming across it downstream from the Hoover Dam. And Larry's group further splits, with half approaching the access bridge near the dam, and the other half heading for the hill the howitzer is on. And then the battle commences, and there's some deaths, but they manage to take the howitzer and the access bridge. But when Larry leads his people onto the dam itself, he finds Trash standing in the middle, who pushes a detonator and blows up the dam, taking out himself and Larry in the process, and sending a huge wall of water downstream towards Stu. So we have a big, loud CGI set piece here, which kind of takes away from the whole purpose of the character of Trash Can Man, who is very much King's equivalent to Gollum from Lord of the Rings. And here he's just there to blow himself up and kill Stu, who doesn't really... not kill Stu, kill Larry, who kind of loses his character arc here. He just kind of dies for no reason. That's too bad. And so Stu almost uses his power to stop the water, but doesn't, wanting to lie low. But he just barely alerted Flag, who makes the water appear like a flood of blood to Stu. So, possible Shining movie reference here. Who manages to hold onto the cliff and climb away from it regardless. And Flag then speaks with Lloyd, telling him to lead an evacuation north and that he plans to take Stu's power for himself. And while Stu, using a portable car battery charger he brought with, and they attach solar powers to it to charge it up, commandeers a car in a Las Vegas suburb. Nick leads a small team and takes the howitzer on Little Sister Peak without any bloodshed, signaling Glenn for the main body of the army to move forward. Stu gets in a block of the strip and hands the car over to a man fleeing with his kid, and he passes an advertisement for a show that shows a man in a white tunic sword fighting with a man in a blue tunic with a bird mask on. So that's the nod to the original cover art from the book. And it's also the source of the inspiration for the dreams that Flag has been sending out to Stu. Like, he looked at this billboard and went, that's a good image, and sent it down to dream. That's actually kind of funny now that I think of it. And meanwhile, the evacuating Las Vegans, which include Harold, are being led by Lloyd, but they're surrounded by the Boulderites and agree to surrender, only for the Little Sister howitzer to move, load itself, and fire of its own accord, killing many of them. And Nick, not knowing what to do, he grabs a shell to block the barrel, but manages to fire once more, and Stu is forced to use his powers in full, protecting the crowd from the blast. And Flag senses this, turns on all the lights in Vegas just using his power, which is kind of cool considering the power is actually gone. He bursts through the window, walking down the side of the Luxor Pyramid towards Stu. And the fight commences with Stu having to block everything Flag is throwing at him. He can't protect the people from the howitzer anymore, and Nick, seeing that the silver shield is dissipating, runs and shoves the shell he picked up into the barrel right as it's about to fire, destroying the weapon and sacrificing himself in the process. Okay, I like the fact that Flag is such a bastard he's willing to kill his own people to make a point. I do like the fact that while they've changed it, Nick still gets his heroic sacrifice here, and it still has a meaning to it. Not as good as the way he originally goes out in the book, but it fills that function reasonably okay while still trying to be a big, loud action piece, which, once again, this story really doesn't need to be that. So Flag and Stu continue their fight on the strip. Speaking of big, loud set pieces, this basically turns into Matrix Revolutions here. And Flag ripping up the buildings and throwing them, not caring that his own people are getting caught in the attack and dying on Stu's shield, which is just a fucked up image. Flag then starts attacking Franny from a distance, causing her water to break, and Stu can't protect both her and himself. But Harold steps from the crowd and holds Franny's hand, using whatever power he has to help fight off Flag. And the baby is born alive, and Harold disappears into the crowd. So, Harold, I don't get what they're doing with Harold here. Like, why are you giving Harold Lauder his weird redemptive moment here? Like, he helps save the baby, yay! And he's not as bad as he is in the book, because he only kills one person with a bomb, yay! Okay, so he's a good guy now? And when we get to the epilogue of this script, it's going to make even less sense, so what's the point? And this distracts Flag long enough for Stu to get the upper hand and wound him, and Flag, realizing that he's been beaten, drops the top of the Luxor on himself, saying that the people are now Stu's, making out like the responsibility is a threat. And so he kind of does a Seagal in Machete where he kills himself. God damn, I just now grokked that this second. As power leaves his body, leaving just a normal person behind it as he dies, once again implying that there was a person who was taken over by whatever is the power behind Flag, which once again is an interesting idea. And Stu is tempted to take the power, seen floating as silver strands in the air, but he doesn't and lets it dissipate. However, he is badly wounded and too weak to heal himself, but Tom finds him and lets him take his power from him so he can fix himself up, which is a nice little nod to the book where Tom is there, he's there in the right place at the right time and helps Stu. That is actually, as much as I don't like the direction this script takes for this portion of it, that's actually a nice rearranging there, considering the changes they made. And they make their way to the Boulder Army's camp where the wounded are being tended to, both Boulderites and Las Vegans. And Stu has to explain what happened to Nick to Tom, who is accepting of it and goes to his body bag to say goodbye. Stu heads to Franny's tent and hears the baby cooing even before he enters. Back in Boulder, winter is coming on and Stu is helping to prepare for it. It skips ahead a couple months. He tells Glenn that he hopes Harold comes back someday, even if they have to put him in jail. And he no longer feels Flag. And so later that night, we see multiple children are in Boulder now, and that Franny's now 2-month-old daughter is doing well. So in this version, it's a girl, and we don't get the name. And the power is finally turned back on, and the buildings are decorated with Christmas lights. So it's a nice little counterpoint to the dying town of Arnett, the beginning with the Christmas decorations, to the newly born town of Boulder with Christmas decorations. And we see Kojak finally arrive in Boulder, and I completely forgot he had disappeared. When I was reading this, I'm like, oh yeah, heading up the drive to Chautauqua Park, and he barks and presumably someone hears him. And then the credits roll, and we get a mid-credits scene where Harold walks into the city of Tulum, Mexico, which is falling apart and overgrown with plants. His sneakers are in tatters from walking that far, and he loots a pair of gaucho boots from a store window. He greets some nearby foreigners in perfect Spanish, asking who is in charge, smiling like Flag all the while, and it ends. So it's kind of like the ending of the uncut version of The Stand where it's Flag on the beach with these people, but the location this time is specified and it's Harold doing it. So the implication is that the whole thing with Harold getting the VIP treatment and seeing dreams from Flag meant that Flag had him considered as a new vessel. And so now he has the power of Flag inside him and Flag has possessed him. So what was the point of the redemptive moment if he's just going to end up being a vessel for Flag anyways? It would have been better if this wasn't in here. And you've already adapted the entire book. Why are you putting in a sequel hook? So yeah, the Kajganich Draft of The Stand, not terrible. Like it's very well written for the most part. Like it's a competently written and put together script. It's got a good voice to it. Like it's very readable. And there's certain scenes that would be very cinematic. But as an adaptation, it's just not good. It tries to turn it into this big spectacle piece, which really isn't what The Stand is, and I just feel like it doesn't work as The Stand. And I almost wonder if there was some studio notes getting handed around at a time saying, here, make this bigger, make this more actiony, because that kind of seems like something Warner Brothers would do. But anyways, this got turned in, and nothing more really happened with it. Ben Affleck ended up leaving, I guess, to play Batman. I'm guessing it was to play Batman. That's why he left. And so the thing got thrown to limbo again. Scott Cooper, who had done stuff like Black Mass, Out of the Furnace, Crazy Heart, he signed on to direct and eventually left for creative differences. And then in early 2014 was announced that this was when Warner Brothers first hired Josh Boone to write and direct. And the whole thing was that they were going to do it. This time it was going to be as one movie. And he turns in the draft, and next thing we hear is that Warner Brothers likes his draft so much that they ask him to write 4 movies instead. And I would like to read that draft that he wrote as one movie, because he said he wrote it by completely taking apart the chronology of the script and telling it out of order, which that sounds really interesting. He says it starts with the 4 people leaving Boulder to go to The Stand, and then coming back and then telling it and going into flashback. I would really like to read how that version works, because that sounds really interesting. Now, I have The Stand Part 1 by Josh Boone, which was written presumably during this 4-movie thing. And I'm not reading it here because, Josh Boone is involved with that new miniseries, and so who knows how much that influences it, how much we'll see from that in the new miniseries. But, that was interesting, and he was working on it, and then nothing was heard for a while. Then they went, oh no, we're going to do a multi-part Showtime series leading up to a theatrical movie, which Then we heard nothing for a while, and there's apparently rights issues going on with Warner Brothers and CBS. And then that kind of went away for a bit, and then Josh Boone went to work on Revival instead. And then it came back, and apparently there was word that Stephen King nixed the idea of a miniseries because they'd already done it before, but I guess he changed his mind because now it's going to be a 10-episode CBS All Access series, 9 or 10, I think. I'm very curious to see how that turns out, especially since Josh Boone has stuck with this project for 6 years through multiple different versions of what it was going to be. And while at the beginning of the episode, I do have my qualms with what they're doing with it, I am looking forward to seeing how it turns out, and I hope it's good. So yeah, that's where we are now. Very interesting how this project went around so many different times and eventually just became a miniseries again. So yeah, that was The Stand, and I hope you enjoyed it. But before I go, I'm going to have to read off a review that was left on Stitcher, and I told the guy I was doing it I would read it off, and I'm saving it for the end. And unfortunately, Stitcher no longer allows reviews for some reason, but I'm going to read this review off because I said I would. It's from 80s Power, and it says that it's titled Delving into the Arcane Texts of Movie Industry. This podcast represents, to my knowledge, the most in-depth look at the mostly unknown yet endlessly fascinating, at least to a movie junkie like myself, stratum of pop culture, namely the heaps of movie screenplays which have ended up either consigned to oblivion or altered beyond recognition in the course of production. Oftentimes, the screenplays of major franchise pictures unearthed to the chagrin of various movie execs, no doubt, and subsequently related to us in careful detail by the host emerge as more compelling or at least more coherent works than what was actually been served to the audience on the screen. We are then provided with a tantalizing glimpse at an alternative reality where neither budget nor studio meddling presents an issue for the production of major Hollywood pictures. Other time, the scripts are every bit as bad and worthy of mockery as any of the clunkers churned out on a regular basis by the industry, showing that incompetence can be found at every level of production. The host, KiramidHead, is pleasant to listen to, oftentimes amusing in his commentary and wastes no time on extraneous bullshit, a complaint I have about a lot of podcasters. Thank you. I try not to go off topic. The only criticism I could offer, aside from the quality of the occasional co-hosts who are hit and miss, is that the discussion can sometimes get a bit mired in the minutia of the plot being described. I want to give all the details, as many as I possibly can. And I like having my co-host. It makes the conversation more interesting to me, but fair is fair. However, I can understand the possible underlying dilemma, whether to direct the podcast primarily to those who are never going to be exposed to the material being covered in any other manner, i.e. the vast majority of potential listeners, or to those select few like yours truly who may wish to pursue the screenplays in question and read them themselves. Anyway, I heartily recommend the podcast when interested in the creative process behind major studio productions and the wealth of stories and ideas that the Hollywood industry throws out throughout said process for one reason or another. Other than obtaining and reading these unproduced screenplays on one's own, this is probably the best avenue for learning about this stuff. Just be prepared for long listens. I try to make these episodes shorter. It never fucking works. So yeah, thanks for the 5-star review, 80s Power, even though it doesn't matter anymore because Stitcher doesn't allow reviews anymore, so the star rating doesn't matter, but thank you for that. And hope you guys enjoyed the episode, and until next time, bye.